Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Board of Behavioral Sciences Exempt Setting Committee meeting. Today is February 23rd. The time now is 8:34. We're at 1625 North Market Boulevard, Sacramento, the Department of Consumer Affairs hearing room. Present now, actually, let's establish a quorum first. Christina, please.
Good morning.
Good
Christina Wong.
Here.
Betty Conley.
Here.
Deborah Brown.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Thank you. So let's proceed to have the staff introduce themselves. And next, if the public are ready and you're willing, and your introduction is voluntary. So I'll start with my right-hand side.
Hi, Steve Sodergren, Board of Behavioral Sciences, Assistant Executive Officer.
Kim Madsen, Executive Officer for the Board of Behavioral Sciences.
Christina Wong, LCSW member. Yes.
Anthony Payne, Board Counsel.
Betty Conley, LEP member.
Deborah Brown, Public.
Dee Berger, Regulatory Analyst for the Board.
Roseanne Helms, Legislative Analyst for the Board.
Dean Porter, California Association for LPCCs.
Stanley Wong, NASW.
Robert Mendelson from the Southern California Counseling Center in Los Angeles, representing ourselves and 3 other counseling centers from Southern California. Thanks.
David Jensen, one of the staff attorneys with Exempt.
Good morning. I'm Robin Femmelby, the Assistant Deputy Executive Officer for the California Victim Compensation Board.
Welcome, everyone. Yes, I know. So this is the Christie Show. So, let's move forward. To start the first agenda item, and that is the discussion and possible recommendation regarding practice setting for LCSW, LMFT, and LPCC students.
Thank you. Yes, so there's a lot to absorb in this item, so we'll go through it the best that we can, and I'll guide you through it. I don't necessarily expect today that we'll come out of it with very tangible things, but I want to kind of get a framework going and do the best we can with that. So we had presented back in November the results of the survey that we did for the Practicum coordinators for all the schools for all 3 professions. And so after we had looked at those survey results, we kind of had 3 areas we wanted to address. First was to clarify the acceptable sites for Practicum students and strengthening the school Practicum site and supervisors' responsibilities about the placement and monitoring of students in the field. And we had determined at that point we wanted to focus on LMFT and LPCC because we don't regulate the social work, Practicum and field work like we do these others. And then the third was creating a definition of different setting types, especially for private practice, but we already have a definition for exempt settings, but there are also settings that don't fall into either of those that we would like to somehow define. And those definitions are sort of a larger issue than just practicum settings for students, but it's really important in this context so that it will help us, I think, define, where students, what's acceptable and what's in the best interest of their training. So the committee directed staff to bring back some additional information, and we've got a lot of information, so we'll give it a start here. So I want to kind of go back through some of the notable findings from the Practicum survey results. And let's see, let's go to attachment A. I'm going to cover a few things that I think are the most pertinent for today. So the top 3 most common settings where students are being placed and performing clinical work are exempt settings. No surprise there. So the nonprofit and charitable, public schools, and governmental agencies. Just over 40% of programs place students performing clinical services in for-profit entities that are not a private practice. They felt that the top 3 most important qualities of a suitable practicum setting are effective supervision, quality learning and training opportunities, and exposure to a diverse spectrum of clients and experiences. nearly 40% of respondents indicated there are certain type of settings allowed by law that are generally not suitable for student placement. And for those people who provide an explanation, it's either settings that are limited in scope, such as substance abuse treatment centers or crisis centers, or organizations that have some ethical issues or that are unstable. Some schools that use extra precaution when placing students in certain types of settings are especially those settings that treat the severely mentally ill or high-risk clients. There are some schools, this is kind of odd that they kind of reported that they don't necessarily use extra precaution. They kind of let things be worked out as, it was slightly concerning to hear that some schools don't feel that there are certain settings that should be concerning. So we're not sure where that was coming from, but it's something to think about. The number one factor that might lead a school to decide against placing students at a site is lacking or poor supervision or monitoring. And then the lastly important thing for today is about 30% of schools don't have enough practicum sites available to meet the needs of all of their students. So most of the schools, it's sort of a collaboration in finding practicum sites. The student and the schools work on it, but it really is more the student's primary responsibility to find a site. Okay, so back to the memo. So one of the first things we want to tackle, and again, we just want to kind of maybe develop a framework today, is defining the settings. Right now, and we want to do this, like I said, in general, define settings, but also define them in terms of where students maybe should be placed. I don't necessarily want to, we kind of need to go through the whole memo before we can maybe go back and do that, because there's a lot to consider and take into account. So, but current law defines the settings where LMFT and LPCC students or trainees can work are, and it's very, very general. The setting must lawfully and regularly provide mental health counseling or psychotherapy. The setting must provide adequate oversight. It must meet the experience and supervision requirements and within the scope of practice. And it cannot be a private practice. But again, there's no definition of private practice in the law. There is an LCSW law, but it seems to be an incomplete definition when you start thinking about it. And it just says it's a setting that's owned by a licensee. So when we look at developing a definition, it is important to keep in mind that it will affect other laws that reference private practice. I don't see that there are any issues when I went through. I don't think that what we will do today will negatively affect those, but we'll really closely watch that and work with legal counsel on that. So attachment C is the next thing I wanted to reference. Those are some definitions that I was able to find from other states or some professional associations, and I just kind of want to call your attention to a couple of them that I think maybe are helpful. The Board of Psychology had a definition in their law, but they changed some things around and they removed the definition. But what it had said was that it's a psychological corporation or a medical corporation with the exception of a nonprofit or a clinic that provides mental health services under a contract to a local mental health agency. I just wanted to say, give you that, but I'm not sure it's quite the definition we're looking for. The New York definition, they don't have one in their law, but their website listed that it occurs when any licensee commences practicing for profit, absent any planned corporate structure, so they exclude corporations, and the practitioner is responsible independently for his or her professional actions, which result in charges of professional misconduct and liability, and for any employee. Ohio definition means an individual who independently, in partnership, or in a corporation practices counseling and sets up his or her own condition of exchange with those clients, identifies herself as in any manner as a counselor in offering such services. So you've got definitions that include corporations and some that do not. And the National Health Service Corps, that's the last one in the list, They define solo or group private practice as a clinical practice made up of either one or many providers where the providers have ownership and an invested interest in the practice. Talks about the services and can be organized as entities that are fee for service, capitation, or a combination of the two. Anyway, and then it goes into group definitions. So those are some examples. So based on that, I felt like some of the major themes are that they have ownership and responsibility for the practice. They're not an employee, and they receive direct party or third-party reimbursement. And so thinking about whether we include just individuals in solo practice or corporations, I think is something we're going to have to kind of work on and think about the possible implications a little bit more, but I wanted to go through a little bit about the different types of private practices. And this is, we had a great article from Exempt, and I'm glad David is here today because I know that you're very well versed in this area. It's something new that we're learning more and more about as we're going through this. So you have a sole proprietorship. So that's the only type of entity that can be formed by a single therapist. There are no state filing requirements. It's completely controlled by the practitioner. They have sole liability. Then you have a general partnership, which is two or more licensee. They're co-owners. They have a written agreement that specifies management and control of the practice. Each are liable for the business and obligations. There are no state filing requirements. Then you have a limited partnership, which is not frequently used, but basically you have general partners and limited partners, where the general partners have the more control and the limited partners are more of a passive investor. And they have a little more structure. They have to file with the state and federal government. And then we are familiar with professional corporations. We do regulate them somewhat. They're regulated by the Moscone-Knox Professional Corporation Act. And so they have to, again, it's being a corporation, they have to file articles of incorporation and meet federal and state requirements. Most of the laws governing general corporations also apply to professional corporations as well. They have to have bylaws, which provide a set of rules for the corporations and their board of directors. And so that's sort of the range of what falls into types of private practices. So I came up with maybe a starting point for a definition, and we can come back to this later after we go through some of this. But if anybody has any thoughts after I'm reading through this, I would be interested to hear at this point kind of where your thinking is. So where I kind of started was a business that provides clinical mental health services, which is owned or operated by one or more licensed mental health professionals who have responsibility for the practice and services provided and set up conditions of client payment or reimbursement. So let's maybe stop there. Is there any thoughts on this area? Anything you want me to research a little more? Back. If not, I'll just continue.
Will that be helpful for the third line, say clinical services provided? Or something, just be more specific, to delineate, not just, it's not any services, hair cutting or whatever, but clinical services.
Sure.
Yeah, or as defined by, whatever, the section of the law, right? And then we'll refer back to, that context of what clinical services means.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I'm wondering if, because I like where you're going with this, and by the way, awesome research.
Oh, thank you.
Amazing.
Thank
So, because some of the things I liked from some of the definitions and reading in the packet, I like the fact that it was expressly stated that the owner was not an employee. Some language perhaps thinking about including that in the statement, and that these, like the sole proprietorship and the general partnership, there are no state or federal filings required, and I think that's kind of could be an area where we could provide some distinction, because currently we say private practice, and as Roseanne and I have talked about it, I don't know extensively, but frequently about, well, Kaiser's a nonprofit, charitable, and clearly we look at the organization structure and go, how is that a private practice? So that I'm wondering if we make those distinctions.
Or we exclude, where we maybe define it and what it does not include. Is what you're
Correct,
thinking.
and maybe look at that to see if there's any impact with that exclusion.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what, but I like referencing that you're not the employee either.
Yeah.
So, Roseanne, go ahead.
I was just going to add that maybe when it says who the professionals have responsibility for the practice, I would say maybe that they have sole responsibility, that it's not, under another company or something like that.
So, board members, any feedback? Any suggestion? Okay, public, in regards of the definition, please come up.
Janley Wong, NASW, and I also want to make sure that David knows that if I misspeak or misunderstand, he's the expert. So I'm a little concerned about moving the definition of private practice away from sole proprietorship to include corporations. And the issue there is that there are many corporations that are businesses that are either for-profit or nonprofit, and by considering them private practice, it could limit the options that students, MSW students, have, because there is a prohibition against private practice for MSW students now. So to say, well, this includes corporations, this includes businesses, you're really cutting the settings where MSW students can get their graduate practicum experience. So I think it's important to think about that. And the temptation would be, let's go and play around with all the laws and somehow make all of this work. And the question is, why would you want to do that? Why would you make things more complicated rather than simpler? I think the goal actually is to try to be simpler, but you've waded into an area which is very well outlined by David's piece that is more complicated than you think. It's much more complicated. So when you say there are no filings for corporations, there's actually several filings, but maybe they don't come to you, okay? The first and foremost is tax filings. If a corporation has income, and even if it doesn't, or a loss, they have to have tax filings, both federal, state, and perhaps local, if, for example, you're in New York City or someplace like that. The second thing they have is they have reports. They have shareholder reports or corporation reports, annual reports, quarterly financials. So this idea that they're out there running around without responsibility to report to anybody is not accurate. Okay, there's reporting responsibilities. They just don't come to you. That's all. Nor should they. Nor should they come to you. You're not a taxing authority, and you're not necessarily beholden to the owners or the shareholders of the corporation, which is what shareholder reports are and financial reports. Then the other thing I'm not really sure of is why we're actually talking about what constitutes a proper setting for students. The complication here is that there should be, and if there aren't, we really need to look at these unaccredited or generally accredited schools. There should be educational objectives for these practicum settings. They're not like pre-licensure settings. If you start thinking of them as pre-licensure settings, then you start thinking about you need to regulate them because they're pre-licensure settings. So I get it that we just did the 90-day rule, which is actually bad public policy, very bad public policy. And the reason why it's bad public policy is because the board is giving credit for hours where they have no regulatory authority. think about that. You are giving credit for hours where you have no regulatory authority. That is bad public policy. You should not be giving credit where you have no regulatory authority. But because of the pressures involved in our organization is guilty of it too, from a parity standpoint, everybody goes along with it. Okay, fine. But still, think about, do you want to be responsible for the educational goals, objectives, and oversight of practicum settings for a master's program? That's what we're talking about, a master's program in marriage family therapy or professional clinical counseling, and to a lesser degree for social work. That's what students have to do to get their master's degree. It's not a pre-licensure setting. Now, I know my colleagues back here, a few of them might think, oh, Janley, you're totally off base because the goal of the master's degree is to do private practice or clinical practice. So we need to regulate those master's programs and their practicum sites. Well, so be it for those other disciplines, but for social work, it's such a broad discipline. It covers many areas, ranging from macro practice, community organization practice, all kinds of practice. It's not narrowly defined. So you don't want to step in with a narrowly defined private practice, clinical sort of oversight over a master's degree that is really broad and has been around for over 100 years. So I hope you keep this in mind and try to avoid overcomplicating things and try to think that, you know, what is your goal here? What's your purpose? And when I thought this committee was originally set up, and I did speak up about it, was that when someone registers with the board, not when they're in school, but when someone registers with the board, you do have some responsibility in terms of where they might work and where they might gain hours. Now, historically, you've exempted these settings for probably two reasons. The first reason is that the employers in these settings did not want to necessarily have additional expense in terms of being a setting for people to collect pre-licensure hours. There is some expense to have trained, licensed, qualified supervisors for these registrants in these settings. The second is that most, if not all of these settings are fairly well covered by multiple layers of supervision. They're not all clinical layers, but there are multiple layers. Many of you worked in these settings. Some of you currently work in these settings. You have layer upon layer of oversight and supervision. You have your direct supervisor, you have your managerial program supervisor, you have your administrative supervisor, you have the director of the program, and in public settings and private settings, you have a board of directors or the county board of supervisors, ultimately as the oversight and authority that's responsible. This is completely different than private practice, completely different. So that was the origin, at least in my opinion, of this. David might have a different view because he's been around as long as I have. But, but please keep that in mind. So when we start to go into the school setting and the practicum sites, I'm beginning to think, are we adrift here? Are we, like, where are we headed here versus kind of this original reason for exempt settings? Thank you.
I just wanted to respond to a couple points. He has a good point that when we do the definition of private practice, that will affect social work interns and that's the term for them who are in their degree program. But that, for everything else that we're talking about, that only affects LCS or LPCC and LMFT because we already do regulate and have definitions for their practicum sites. And the reason that we approach this is because there's a lot of confusion out there among the schools, especially we had a law change in the early 2000s, and since that time, they've had very much difficulty in determining what's allowable. So
And actually, Jenny, thank you so much for, providing the more foresight discussion, because I think that that's the next part that we will be talking about. So, and definitely, having the historical perspective is important. So, so thank you for that, for the feedback and kind of like, the backdrop of, what should be in consideration. So thank you. In terms of, the private practice definition, so any other feedback from the public? Okay, so seems like, it's pretty acceptable. So let's move on to, for the next part. Yeah.
Sounds good. So sort of the next thing is, when we do a definition for private practice, it won't help us define other types of for-profit entities, and I'm not sure what to call these yet. Other for-profits maybe. So you have general corporations such as Telecare, and that type of a corporation was kind of new to me, or to my awareness, that you do have some big corporations out there that have multiple, I think Telecare has, I think they might have multiple locations. 34,000 clients a year. I think they have multiple locations. They're huge. But I provided one of their materials that they pull out. I mean, it does look like they're doing good work. They've been around since 1965. And so, I just wanted to kind of give a little bit of information about one of these big corporations. I don't think it's terribly common to have something like this. The materials, I think it's in this one, they talked a little bit about why they structured themselves this way, as opposed to doing a nonprofit and maybe getting some other funding sources. So they do talk about their history a little bit. Then you have other types of corporations, which I didn't really list, but there are other types out there. A lot of for-profit substance abuse recovery programs. That, I think, is a very big issue, and I do believe students get placed in those, even though in our survey it came out that that's maybe not giving people a broad range of experience. But then again, in some cases it might be, because some of these substance abuse treatment centers are starting to advertise that they cover, we treat anxiety or we treat bipolar disorder, in addition. So the book's a little bit open there. Then you have for-profit hospitals and then for-profit medical groups. I learned that Kaiser, their hospital and their health plan are nonprofit, but their medical group is for-profit. So that was kind of interesting to find out. Then, to complicate matters, you have not-for-profit entities that are not a 501c3. But again, these don't seem to be terribly common. So the 501c3 is nonprofit and charitable, registered with the IRS. There are some that are maybe not considered, don't meet that definition of charitable, so have a different code. And I looked at all the different codes. I think you might see some that are the 501c19, which is a veteran service organization. So they may have some mental health, but I think it's so tiny. We haven't heard that there's a problem with not allowing these, so I think maybe we don't have to worry about those types of settings. So all of the above types of entities are, other than, private practice, are currently allowed if they meet those 3-point requirements in the law about regularly providing psychotherapy and, making sure it's within the scope and all that. So and that came out of the Practicum coordinators. They do use all of these setting types as reported in the survey. Actually, let's flip to attachment E, because that gives us a little bit more detail on the setting types that are for-profit. And I kind of started taking a look at what types of facilities require state licensure, because before we changed our definition of allowable settings for students, we did have an actual list of the types of settings. It was a different way of doing it. And there was a list, one of the lists of types of settings were all ones that required state licensure. So I wanted to kind of point those out in this list. Some absolutely require it. Some of them may, depending on the circumstances. So The for-profit settings reported by the Practicum coordinators, the main type is a mental health clinic and counseling center, and they may or may not require state licensure. I've put in a call to the Department of Public Health to get a little more clarification because they regulate these types of settings. I have not been able to get an answer back, so we'll keep working on that. And you have an outpatient intensive mental health treatment center, outpatient alcohol and drug treatment center are absolutely required to be state licensed, as well as a residential mental health treatment center. And then your inpatient alcohol and drug treatment centers are licensed, a medical hospital, a psychiatric hospital, any licensed health facility, really. And there's a few others that are listed that aren't as commonly used. But you do have things like, a tiny percentage of the schools might place somebody in an employee assistance program, which I thought was kind of interesting. And some of them use like a skilled nursing home or assisted living facility. So you really do have a range. And some do place students in a crisis care intervention program. So let's go back to the memo here now that you've got a little bit of a view of the 4 types of for-profits. And some of these may not necessarily be for-profit, but they can be. So, yes, sure.
Dave Jensen Camp. I think it might be really helpful. I think Jan Lee was kind of getting there, but it might be really helpful to hear from the board historically why there was a limitation on trainees in private practice in the first place. Because one of the, this is like, I've been with CAMP coming up on 16 years now, but these rules were in place when I arrived. I think we're going way back, probably to the formation of the profession itself. But I think uncovering that is going to help, get on one side of the road or not. Because one of the complications is the 6-year rule. If you're registered, if you blow their 6-year rule, then they're prohibited from working in a private practice any longer. Then they got to shift to one of these other settings. So I think answering the question of why we didn't want them in that setting in the first place would help answer the second question of, do we want them working 7 years, down the road, or should they still be subject to that initial limitation too? I don't know. I don't know how far Kim's institutional memory.
So I probably have 10, 11 years, I think. Well, hang on here. Yeah, about between 10, 12 years association total time with the board. That rule was in place before I got here. I'm
Exactly.
sure it was in place before Paul got
Right, exactly,
there.
definitely.
So part of our challenge when we try to figure out why the board did what they did, when we go back and we look at meeting minutes and documentation, is virtually non-existent.
Yeah.
We really struggled even just to come up with this historical perspective for the 90-day rule. And we relied on CAMP for a lot of the information because there's just nothing there.
Right.
It's embarrassing to say.
Yeah.
So we go to get, after I'm gone, after Steve's gone, somebody will be able to research why we did what we did. And then they can make a judgment whether, we did it with a sane mind, of sound body, as they say. But yeah, right, there's just nothing.
Yeah.
I
remember talking with Mary Greenersma about it, and her explanation was it was to work as a disincentive. It
To
made
work as a
people
what?
as a disincentive. So there was a block that it forces them to get their hours done and get into the testing phase, because then they can go into the more, and then you got the control issues. I think Jan laid those out pretty well. There's more of a money angle in the private practice than you got the institutional supervision and control with the nonprofits. But that's sort of the underlying rationale, and we have to think, do we want associates at places for 6, 7, we don't want them camping out there for really the rest of their careers. They can just keep renewing their associate registration. anyway, that's kind of I think we're, there's just not a lot back there in terms of why they drew the line, where they drew it. The other thing I pointed out is that in terms of the word lawfully, a lot of times, and maybe we're viewing that too restrictively, especially with the telecare sort of phenomenon, because lawfully for them, they're not set up as a professional corporation, they're a regular corporation, but they have a contract with various counties. And so the contract then between that and whichever county would be the lawful authority to do the service in that particular area. I think we could expand the concept of lawfully, not just to include articles of incorporation or structure, but actually the legal authority by the municipality to engage in that sort of mental health work. Another source of information, though. Anyway, work in progress, though, right? Thank you.
It's very helpful.
I will add, in terms of doing legislative research, we can go back and look at committee bill analysis for about to 91 is where it ends. So we can sometimes get some of that, but unfortunately, I think that the law that David's referencing was sometime in the 70s or 80s, and it's non-existent. I can't pull up the legislative histories. But if anybody has it lying around their office, then we would be more than grateful to take a look at it.
So it means that, Jenny, you cannot retire.
Janley Wong, NASW. Unfortunately, the people that I relied on have retired from CAMP. I relied on CAMP, in particular Dick Leslie and Mary Remersbaum, who had at least a decade and a half or longer, more experience than I did. So they're long gone now, but be that as it may, you might want to also think about going forward. What direction do you want to go going forward? Because as we can tell by this excellent report from Christy, that the landscape has changed quite a bit from 4 decades ago. We have multiple business structured entities that are providing service. For example, the telecare example is a great example. When do they venture into the realm of professional corporations? Because currently they're, according to the report, about 40% employee owned. So, and what's their purpose aside from contracting, which is a great point that Dave brought up, is to deliver clinical services. That's their purpose. So the idea of a professional corporation, as you know from Christy's report, is that clinicians form a corporation. They're the shareholders or owners of the corporation with the express purpose of providing clinical services as defined by the different scopes of practice under the BBS statute. So when does it get there? I don't know. Certainly they're headed that way from a very small employee ownership to now 40%, who knows how much larger. And many corporations, as you know, they have provided employees with the options, stock options, to buy into the corporation as a form of benefit, whether it's to supplement the salaries that they pay the employees or to be part of, which has to be carefully regulated, the retirement or pension plan. So it's a complicated setting. And back to the whole idea of corporations and clinical practice, I think the reason for the Moscone-Knox legislation, as well as the professional corporation language in the Business and Professions Code, is to guard against the corporate practice of medicine, to guard against the corporate practice of medicine. What does that mean? Well, first of all, generally speaking, corporations are considered businesses, and generally speaking, they're in it to make money. And whether you say that, Kaiser is nonprofit, when you look at their $1 billion in quarterly profit, you've got to ask yourself, what does that really mean? $1 billion in quarterly profits for a nonprofit called Kaiser. So the idea about corporate practice of medicine is if you put profits above service, which is what business does, just ask that person in the White House. You talk about fee splitting, you talk about kickbacks, and you talk about inappropriate referrals. So we're overlaying that ethical parameter over this concept of corporations, businesses, and for-profit. How do we guard against that? We can't just say, well, you can't do it, but we can say, which is basically this idea behind laws regulating the corporate practice of medicine, is there are some things you should not and cannot do, and they are unethical. So fee splitting, what does that mean? That means you take some of the money that's received for providing services and use it for something that provides no service whatsoever to the clients. No service whatsoever. So the clients are paying a fee for service, but they're not getting their money's worth in terms of service. Kickback is the same concept behind fee splitting, but it may not involve a percentage of the fees. It may be that, oh, well, I'm going to see this client and I'm going to give you $100 as something, your share of me seeing this client, with the same idea that you're charging the client this additional money, and it's not really designed to provide any service for the client. Inappropriate referrals, when you start saying, well, go see this other client, therapist or provider, and it's not even in consideration of what the client needs. It's really this idea of, well, we keep the business all within our own circle of providers, we can make more money, we can make more profit, whether it's an appropriate referral or not. So your board, based on this long history in the statute, has some responsibility to keep an eye on corporate practice of medicine, has some responsibility to make sure that these future business structures and entities don't get into an area that's unethical and unprofessional and ultimately possibly harmful to clients. And then finally, back to the idea of the prohibition on private practice or the limitations on private practice. Before the MFT or MFCC statutes went into place, as well as the LCSW statutes, there were tremendous abuses going on. Private practitioners would bring on a dozen students or a dozen postgraduates, pay them very little money, have them do all this work with clients, and they would collect the bulk of the client fees. So fortunately, over the years, the Board of Behavioral Sciences, the Business and Professions Committees in the legislature put into place some something to guard against that kind of abuse. And it's still here today because recently you all set a limit of 3 supervisees in private practice. So you're following that historical tradition. Thank you.
Robert Mendelson, Southern California Counseling Center. Just to sort of follow on that last comment, that's where I was going. It's more of a question. I'm wondering if the definition of a private practice will include the terms under which an MFT or an LPC associate can work there. As I too find, I work with a lot of pre-licensed people, a lot of supervisors. I do find it remains somewhat unclear about it. Maybe it's unnecessary, but it seems to me somewhat unclear out there.
Yeah, I want to clarify something Jan Lee said in terms of telecare, so you guys understand the structure. Don't want to step on Mr. Payne's territory, but telecare is a regular domestic stock corporation, just like AT&T. Its shares can be owned by anybody. Professional corporations, shares, the owners of it, have to be licensed people. And certain corporations have certain limitations on which licenses can own shares of stock in that professional corporation. So Telecare, no matter how many of its shares are owned by clinicians, ultimately, if there's one share that's owned by a regular person, it cannot possibly be a professional corporation. What is interesting, though, is that you could have a chiropractic practice. They could sell shares to an MFT. Well, now you got a licensed person there. If they're supervising, then technically that would be an okay site, even though it's kind of funky. But we're seeing more and more of these sort of intermingled practices sort of rising up in the new era of mental health services. I just want to make sure you guys understand the distinction between regular corps and professional corps.
Thank you, David. So it looks like, it's very clear as mud again. So, so I just from my perspective, with, the professional organization's feedback, it's probably conducive for us, if we're confusing here, what really are the definition, it's really important that, we at least set some guidelines, what we're looking at. If we're confused, then, the licensees will be very confused, and then the agencies will be confused, everybody will be confused. So I think, looks like the direction definitely, as recommended by Christy, that, we try to at least put some definition, a working definition to begin with, and then see how we can define all these different types of, agencies, and then come back and, we can rediscuss it. Yeah, I think that's certainly the way to go. Yeah.
Okay.
So that's what I'm hearing from the stakeholders, right? So I think we can probably move forward, to draft up, some languages, and then we can go from there, and then, like a little working document, and incorporate more ideas
Yeah.
to refine them.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah. Okay. So let's move to the section. What?
Well, the rest of what we're going to talk about might inform how we write these definitions too. So,
Yes.
we'll kind of maybe
Absolutely.
touch back to this a little bit later. So the next thing I want to talk about is I was directed at the last meeting to research the history of law changes about the allowable trainee placements. So it was back in 2003, and luckily there were some meeting notes that I was able to find. So at that, prior to 2003, the allowable setting types were an exempt setting or any of the below that were licensed by the state. So you have a licensed health facility, a social rehabilitation facility, community treatment facility, pediatric day health and respite care, or licensed alcoholism or drug abuse recovery treatment facility. So it seems like that last focus was on licensed by the state, and now I think there's a broader range of places that are licensed. And then, according to the notes, those settings were selected because of the assumption of institutional infrastructure and controls as opposed to a private practice. And the law changes were proposed for three reasons, according to the notes, is that just having a list of setting types did not help ensure that trainees were getting appropriate experience. There's another concern that there were not enough trainee placements available, that list was too narrow. And then there was a growing problem with agencies contracting with entities that were not acceptable settings. So while technically, the person was working for the one setting, they would be placed on contract somewhere else. So the board, they considered adding additional setting types to the list, but then again, it wouldn't have addressed concerns about necessarily the appropriateness of the supervised experience, and it would have been difficult to list all the possible acceptable setting types. So they decided, let's keep this simple, and what they thought was clear, which turned out to maybe not be quite as clear. And then also, of course, provide for public protection. So again, they wound up with this list, has to lawfully and regularly provide mental health counseling and psychotherapy, must provide oversight, not a private practice, and then experience may be gained solely as part of the position for which the trainee volunteers or is employed. And that addressed the contracting issue. Roseanne and I have always wondered where that came from, so now we know. There are some additional laws about practicum I want to go over real quick. If we could go to attachment F, like Frank. this goes in a little bit more about how much experience, what the practicum has to provide training in, how the supervision works. So I just want to go over that to give us some context for thinking about this. So for LMFT students, they have to have a total of 225 hours, 150 of which have to be face-to-face experience performing counseling. The other 75 can be client-centered advocacy or more counseling. The practicum has to provide training in applied use of theory and psychotherapeutic techniques, assessment, diagnosis, and prognosis, treatment of a variety of areas, professional documentation, and client resources. The experience has to be coordinated between the school and the site. The schools have to do the final approval of each site. The schools have a written agreement with each site that details the parties' responsibilities, including supervision methods, regular progress reports, and evaluations of the student. And then if the student is gaining experience toward licensure, which I think in probably almost every case for an LMFT student that is what's occurring, then of course that you have to meet all of those experience requirements for licensure. So I'm not going to list all of those, but just as a basis, they have to have a licensed supervisor. They have to have the 1 hour of individual supervision or 2 hours of group every week, and then there's that ratio supervision for they have to have additional supervision when they go over 5 hours of client contact in each setting every week. And then your group supervision cannot contain more than 8 supervisees. And then the supervisor, they monitor that students closely. They, do the evaluation. They review the diagnosis and treatment decisions, and making sure that trainee is competent to provide services at the site where they're practicing and they're compliant with the laws. And those few that I just now covered apply to those gaining experience. So some of those you won't see in LPCC law, and so I'm going to go over that next. They actually have a little bit of a higher number of hours. They have to have 280 of strict clinical counseling experience. They don't allow the client-centered advocacy. And the training has to include, it's very similar to the list of issues or of content that has to be covered in the practicum. I would say the things that are in addition are maybe issues of development, adjustment, and maladjustment, and then health and wellness promotion. So that's where it's a little bit different. And then similar responsibilities in terms of the written agreement, the schools approving the sites. And then, but the bigger difference is that they can't count that experience toward licensure. So the supervision ratios are the same, but beyond that, it doesn't have to be a licensed supervisor. There's not all the other restrictions that go along with gaining experience toward licensure. So go back to the memo. Okay. Now I want to go back to the survey results just a little bit. Looking at the common setting types and getting into a little bit more detail about that. So exempt settings, like I said, are the most common, with the nonprofits being the very most common, schools, and then governmental entities in third place, but all at a very high rate. And of course, all of these types of settings have governmental oversight and institutional controls. I would say probably out of this group, the nonprofit and charitable settings and private schools would have the least amount of oversight. It's more of a high-level oversight as compared to a governmental entity or a public school, which has all the regulations and everything. So, and then looking at the other types of settings, not including an exempt setting or private practice, you've got 42% of students that place students in for-profit entities that are not private practices. So they're being used quite often. And then 31% stated that they placed program students in not-for-profit entities that are not 501c3s. And I think upon reflection, I think they may have interpreted that question to include, some people may have interpreted that question as including government, because as I said, I didn't find very many other types of nonprofits out there that may seem like appropriate sites. I maybe shouldn't have included that here, but so we can maybe disregard that. So I just wanted to note again that everyone struggles when presented with the question as to whether these undefined settings are acceptable, the for-profits especially. And again, while some have governmental oversight or institutional control, some do not. So you've got a for-profit substance abuse treatment facility. There are a lot of regulations, although you do hear of problems as well. So in some ways, they're not closely regulated. In some ways they are, some ways they're not. I already kind of went over the types of facilities licensed by the state, because I think that might help us maybe a little bit there. And I already covered the concerns that schools sometimes have in placing trainees, if it's poor supervision or lacking, poor monitoring, limited in scope, or ethical, unstable. So those are sort of the survey results and the possible concerns we're looking at. I'm going to jump now. I was asked at the last committee meeting to bring back information about accreditation requirements from the Council on Social Work Education. And I decided to go ahead and look at the other, there's a couple of accrediting agencies for the other professions to see what they said about how they regulate practicum sites. Unfortunately, none of them actually specify site requirements, but the CSWE does at least require the program to detail certain information that they then evaluate. What they do with it, or if they then say, give them feedback on it, I'm not sure. But they do ask the schools to report how the field education program supports student safety. They ask for the criteria for selecting field settings and placing students, and then how they provide for continuing dialogue with field education settings. The KCREP and COAMP standards, they emphasize the supervision and the supervisor qualifications. That's how they what they like to see in their accredited programs, as opposed to talking about the sites. So then I thought, well, let me dig a little deeper, and I looked at the APA accreditation standards. And because, as Roseanne informed me, the Board of Psychology requires predoctoral and postdoctoral internships to be accredited by the APA or another acceptable entity. So in a way, they do regulate that. Basically, the APA surprisingly even allows practicum in an independent practice setting, but they do have some extensive requirements, and they do have the program document how the program ensures the quality of the practicum sites, including regularly scheduled site reviews. They have them document how they evaluate practicum experiences, how they identify the strengths and weaknesses of the settings, and how a problem with the site is managed, and then the administrative methods used to ensure that the placements meet certain criteria and how the students are matched to the sites. So they go into it a little bit more, but again, none of them set forth actual requirements. It's report on these things, we're going to evaluate how you do it. So now I want to talk about the written agreement that's required between the school and the site. And again, this is LMFT and LPCC. Both professions require the school and the site to have a written agreement that details each party's responsibilities, including the methods of supervision, and providing for regular progress reports and evaluations of the student performance. That's all that our law specifies in terms of this agreement. But what is interesting is that that there's been a consortium of MFT schools that's been in existence for a long time. It's not just the schools, actually. It's agencies as well that come in, and sometimes I think they have other attendees as well. And they developed a four-way agreement that's used as a template by many schools, and including LPCC programs as well, because about half of the programs out there are dual LMFT, LPCC. I gave you a sample agreement. So the four-way agreement is the school, the site supervisor, and the student, and they all sign the parties. It details all of their responsibilities. So I had thought about maybe we maybe we consider adding into the law about the written agreement some additional responsibilities. And I pulled some things out of the written agreement that we might want to use that I think might help us. It might be one way to strengthen how placements are determined. That might help us when, setting aside the fact that we're going to do definitions, this is another way for schools to determine an appropriate site. So some of the things might, and again, these are already in these agreements that are used by most schools, so it's already being used. So whether or not how helpful this is, I'm not completely sure, but I feel like this is one way to maybe strengthen our laws and make sure everybody is doing this, and these things do protect the student and the supervisor and the school. So one of the items is to require the school to evaluate the appropriateness of the site in terms of the educational objectives and the clinical appropriateness of the experience to be provided to the trainee. Requiring the site to provide adequate resources to the trainee and supervisor, which are necessary for providing clinically appropriate services to clients. Requiring the site to provide the trainee with a crisis or emergency response plan that assures the personal safety of the trainee, supervisor, and clients. And in some cases, that gets a little more specific about whether it's a crisis plan for your client emergency, or a crisis in the building of some kind. So, require the site to evaluate and verify the qualifications of any supervisor, a clinical supervisor. Requiring the site to operate under and require that everyone adheres to the laws that govern practice. This one, I got this a little bit wrong when I went back and looked at it. It's actually, they require the supervisor to adhere to the ethical guidelines of one of the professional associations. But I know maybe, I'm not sure that you can require a site to do that. I mean, I kind of like that idea, but I'm not sure that that's really a doable thing. So I just wanted to clarify that that's actually the supervisor in those sample agreements. And then the last one is requiring the site to notify the school and trainee of any change of ownership or address or phone number, or any other status that may affect the abilities of the trainee to gain experience at the setting. So, so just, again, we don't strictly regulate Practicum sites. We provide, boundaries about them. But, we don't have any enforcement mechanism for the written agreement. But adding terms to the agreement, again, would provide some parameters that would help the school and student evaluate the appropriateness of a site. I don't know, and we haven't talked to the schools about what steps they take to ensure these agreements are followed. I think they rely a lot on the student to report when there are issues. But we also might want to think about some language that would require the school to take steps if there is a concern. And it's something that they're probably already doing, but I think it's also a good thing for our law to explicitly state maybe some of these things, because it does provide for some protections.
So I know I supervise the social work students, the MSW students, and a lot of those, when they come into the placement at the very beginning, they have a lot of forms that they need to sign, and I think that cover a lot of them. Emergency plan, about crisis training, and the appropriateness and the ethics standards and stuff. So I think having the parameters will be really, really great, and and not just applying for the social workers, but also having the language to, with the other license type. I think that would really provide, a more solid standard, what the, again, it's the parameters. Not that, we have, any jurisdiction over them, but I think it's important.
So I want to kind of go over some options about defining acceptable sites, and just keeping in mind that about 30% of schools do not have enough placements for their students. But we also have to balance that with protection of the clients and the students, and that a placement has to be something that, the whole purpose of Practicum is for someone to develop their clinical skills and get that foundation. for further development. So, there may be some options where we can further clarify or define those acceptable types of settings. So, if we feel like the current law is adequate, what we could do is publish some guidance on how schools can better determine whether a setting is allowable according to current law. And I think by definition of creating our definitions, that will make it will help clarify acceptable practicum sites. So in other words, if we create our definitions, by virtue of those definitions, it will better define the acceptable practicum sites. So whatever we put into that private practice definition, basically. So we could publish some guidance. But we have to be really careful with that because they can't be requirements. That they have to be in the law to be requirements. So guidance is a little bit tricky. If the committee feels like it may be necessary to prohibit certain specific types of practicum sites, once we've got the setting definitions developed, we could then gather some information that could help the committee determine which setting types should maybe specifically be prohibited. And then, because we really have to establish why those settings should be prohibited before we can pursue any law changes. We have to have a good justification, and so that's another direction we could take. Then if you feel like the current law should be strengthened, but that maybe there's not justification for banning certain types of sites, we could, determine some additional requirements that could be enforced by the schools, which may include strengthening the written agreements. There are a few other possibilities that I listed here. I'll go over. And then you could apply, if we feel like certain settings maybe are a concern, we could say, well, in these certain types of settings, they may be okay, but you have these additional parameters. So again, you're kind of getting into complicating things, but it may be clarifying as well. So I'm not sure. We might need to kind of see something laid out. Some of those new requirements could be, you have an assigned employee at the agency who's the liaison between the site, the student, the supervisor, and the school. I think there's probably something like this already in place. Then you could require this clinical supervisor to be licensed professional. It's not required for LPCC right now, but it is obviously LMFT students. They're all going to be licensed. And I did see some of the agreements for LPCC the schools do actually require a licensed supervisor, a licensed mental health professional. You could require the school to monitor and evaluate the trainee's ability to provide services at the site where they will be practicing and to the particular clientele being served. That might address some of the concerns about where you have a site with severely mentally ill clients. You might have a student who's already been working in mental health, and maybe they've been a peer counselor or something, and now they're getting their degree, and they've maybe worked with these types of clients, and they might be fine to put in a setting like that. But so right now, it's the supervisor. It's a requirement for supervisors of LMFT students to monitor and evaluate that trainee's ability, but there's nothing in LPCC law that addresses this for the supervisor, and neither law addresses it for the school. Then if you've got clinical supervisors who are off-site or not employed by the site, and I think this is a frequent occurrence where you have off-site supervisors, and a lot of nonprofits especially, sometimes they're volunteer supervisors. Anyway, you could require the site to maybe explain who has that ultimate authority to direct the trainee's clinical decisions and who's going to provide the direction for the client's treatment, because that supervisor not working there, how much authority do they really have? And then the other thing is, what level of access does the supervisor have to the client records? We have some requirements surrounding that for people who are registrants and have an off-site supervisor or a supervisor who's not employed, but nothing for students. So, and some of these are maybe client protection issues as well, but again, we're talking mostly exempt settings. So another thing we thought about is if it's a for-profit setting, one thing that might stop some, prevent some abuses is not allow them to charge trainees for any fees other than maybe for fingerprinting. We know that sites do, we've been talking in the Policy and Advocacy Committee about schools that are practicum sites charging students fees to work there. And what we've found out is mostly it's for training, and they're getting really good training, but there are some situations where it's questionable. In a for-profit setting, you could maybe see that become an issue to me. But again, I don't know. Maybe they bring in some great trainers too. It's a tricky subject. So, and then you could require the student to actually provide an evaluation of the supervision and the agency periodically to the school. So as opposed to just relying on the student just to come to you when there's a problem, actually have them fill something out and say, I'm evaluating this, and that might help the schools evaluate for future placements, things like that. And again, because LPCC students cannot count pre-degree experience, we just don't as closely regulate their experience. So we might want to think about implementing some of the MFT trainee requirements if we feel like there should be, if there's a good rationale for that consistency, which there may be, we might want to make those things more equivalent. So again, I just want to kind of go over our bullet points again about what we want to achieve here and where we want to go with this. So again, we want to define the different setting types, decide on some critical concepts maybe for strengthening the school site agreements, if we want to go there, which I think we could do with very little impact to anybody. Determine how to better define those allowable settings, whether to increase the consistency between LMFT and LPCC where it makes sense to do so. And then what I would like to do, depending where we're at, is maybe reach out to the schools before our next meeting to get some feedback on all of this.
We did put you to work, huh?
That's why I didn't finish the rest of the materials. I know. As quickly as this, so I apologize for those coming up on the later end, but this just turned out to, it's a lot to this, and it's it's, I feel like it's something that's needed some attention for a while. So.
Absolutely. So I want to thank you, Christy. This is not the end of the discussion, but just the presentation itself, how you organize the conceptual framework is really wonderful. At least now, I can kind of like see that, how all these pieces are coming together. So, just really want to applaud you for the good work. I mean, this is a lot of writing. So thank you. So I guess that, then we will, board members, any feedback to what Christy just presented?
That was a lot of that was a lot of work. A couple of things jumped out at me that, I think we need to be really cautious that while we're doing absolutely good work to define settings and everything, we want to make sure that we don't have unintended consequences. Because we've heard from a number of people over the course of our meetings that students are already struggling and institutions are already struggling to find enough places. So while we want to make sure that the places that they have are good places to train and have adequate supervision and all, don't result in harm to anybody, at the same time, I just think we need to be really careful. And the other thing that you brought up, Christy, that I did want to respond to is when I think it was Ben that first made the presentation about the sites that charge trainees. And when he made that presentation, my first response was, that's terrible, that's awful, we shouldn't be doing that. But then a couple of meetings ago, we had some really compelling testimony from places that do in fact charge, but they explained why, and they gave, I thought, a pretty credible explanation for what they use the money for. And, while there are a few perhaps people who take advantage of that and don't provide adequate training. I'm afraid that would be a classic example of we take a broad brush to this and say you can't charge to get at maybe one or two people who aren't doing a good job and really cause some unintended consequences for some agencies that would be really hurt by us making that determination. So that's my input at this point.
To tag on to that, kind of like the opposite, because that has been brought up about the charging, I went back and I looked at the counties. And with the exception of Humboldt, these are very wealthy counties. And so I think that what we might be looking at, and I'm not going to say that we are, I'm just saying that the evidence so far is pointing that way, is supply and demand. And so when you bring up the point that the private and the charging of that, we need to be careful that, albeit they had evidence to show that they're offering training and such, I think we should be cognizant of the fact that, with the exception of Humboldt, those counties are ones that can charge those type of people. So it could create a diversity of individuals, of those who can and those who cannot afford. And so I just want to just put that out there. It was a concern that you brought up as well, that although they might be offering these great bennies, it's not Madera County, it's not Fresno County, it's Ventura County, it is Santa Monica, it's not Santa Monica, it's not a county, Los Angeles County, Santa Barbara. Those are affluent counties, and so they might be able to afford this to people more than, I'm going to say, Madera County is just not going to be happening. There wouldn't be enough people to support that kind of enterprise. So I think I absolutely agree with you. I think that's something we just might want to keep on the forefront. And that's what I've got to say.
And we're going to talk a little bit about our visit with some of those entities that are charging on the next agenda item. But yeah, I hear the concern, but I think what I was struck when we looked at those results of that survey, it's not as if the students were forced into that paying for training. And I think the benefit far outweighs what the students are getting in that environment, and that they have the option to either choose it or not choose it. As long as that remains, I think that's fine. I really struck with the professionalism of the four agencies down south that we spoke with, and it's something I want to do up here in Northern California as well.
And the disparity between maybe, the income would be no different than saying there are those who get to go to Stanford because they can afford it, and then the other ones who go to a CSU because they can't afford it. So, I mean, that disparity is just within our capitalistic system, period.
So, actually, I think out of Ben's, Dr. Caldwell's presentation, one thing that I think out of the P&A meeting, I did ask the question, which is actually his concern, about the potential exploitation of the students. And, he didn't really give a lot of the information. But I think, when we start looking at, how can we make sure that, how do we set some standard? And, I think that's definitely, another area to look at. Are we, making sure that, the standard also protecting, the trainees, that they are not being exploited, whatever it means, But I think, since it was such a big concern, that I think it would be also a good area, to look at. So my question is that, where should we go from here? Because I think, there are three options that throw out, by Christy. So, so should we, take on a more stringent role and to put some more standards in, or whether we feel that it's sufficient, we can let it go.
I think what I'd like to do is perhaps, if the committee's in agreement, is to go back and maybe start crafting some language around a definition for private practice, because I think that's where we truly get stuck.
Right.
I don't think that we need to really, just after all the research and what we're doing and just the reality of the situation, I don't think that we're going to be able to impact government entities or school settings so much. But I think the private practice is an area where we can start with. And then if we want to look at nonprofit and charitable and see if there's any way to better define that so it's not so vague, perhaps, and then bring that back to the committee and the stakeholders for consideration. I really think that was the goal.
Yeah,
I
that's
really-
definitely one of the goals.
Yeah.
And I think I remember, at the very beginning, we do try to, clarify the exempt setting because it's so broad. And, if you look at the survey, most of the respondents are actually employed by the exempt setting, because they are exempt, then, if we, it's not under our jurisdiction, then we're really not serving, a big part of the consumer protection.
Right.
So, yeah.
I think what was interesting out of the survey was, by and large, they're getting more than adequate supervision. There are some safeguards in place.
About
So,
two-thirds.
which I
Yeah.
think was also a concern initially and the reason for the committee. So,
So, how much more work do we want you to do?
So I'm thinking maybe, so I come back with some definitions.
Right.
That, and then what we could do is maybe talk about the implications of those definitions and how they would affect student placements within current law. And then we could decide if we want to go into any of, strengthening the written agreements or anything like that. Like, once we maybe see what these, and I could maybe bring back a little more information on the types of settings if you feel like that. I don't know. I'm not sure how much more I can, but I think starting with those definitions, I think we're going to have to somehow define the other for-profits in addition to private practice, because right now, but I don't know. I guess we can talk more in the office about as we start to develop it.
Right. Betty?
And maybe you said that and I was focusing on something else, but you talked about the structures that are already in place. Do we have a sense of what those are?
I mean, in terms of what the schools put in place? Or?
Yeah, no, you said that, we've talked about there's adequate supervision.
Yeah.
There's a lot of, we got the feeling back from the surveys that there doesn't seem to be a compelling argument to really strengthen a lot of the structure. But in looking at your four-way, I mean, my first thought when I went through that was, well, my first thought was, oh man, we're going to be asking people to do a whole lot more. They're going to say thank you, no thank you. But then I started actually looking at the content. And they're probably already doing that.
right.
So I guess I would be curious, and I don't want to put a ton of work into this, but maybe just a really quick sampling of do sites already have agreements in place? Because, is there I don't want to say a standard because there's never going to be an absolute standard, but are there common practices that are already in place? Because if they're already common practice in most agencies, then maybe we do want to put something in place that would get at those few places that perhaps need to come up a little bit, that need to increase their oversight or their support or their, because there's a part of me that suspects that that's the case, that there's probably 80 to 90% of the sites already have pretty robust practices in place, and that what we're really trying to do is address those few places that maybe students have some challenges with and that they don't understand what to do if there's an emergency, and they don't understand, or there's no guarantee that the people supervising them have adequate licensures, but I suspect we're really talking about a relatively small percentage. So if what we find is that it's not going to impact the guys that are already doing a good job,
Right.
and it's not going to add any onerous, additional requirements, then there would be some possible value to doing something like that. I don't know.
And I have the same thought too. I think, they're just different level of the regulation. At the very least, if it's not going into, the statute and whatnot, we can provide examples. We can provide resources, for the site, to follow. This is, what is suggested that you can do in order to, improve the, in order to, make sure that, the practicum itself, is, you can follow those guidelines, so that, you can have, the students, being not protected, but, that, yeah. The practicum itself is of, some sort of accountability. So, I think that at least that's the least we can do.
Well, yeah, and I think if you look at the four-way agreement, it came out of Fullerton.
Right.
And one of the contact individuals is Mary Reed, and she is extremely active in the MFT consortium and in the MFT community and promoting ethical standards, practice settings, et cetera. And I'm reasonably sure, although I couldn't bet my life on it, but I'm reasonably confident that template has been shared with a lot of the MFT consortiums up and down the state. So I think there is some consistency. I don't want to do a lot of onerous things either. Initially, I was thinking, it was a wild, wild west out there, but the more we get into the research and we speak to those that are actually involved, excuse me, in the training of the students or just having a nonprofit site, it's becoming clear to me that they're doing it, they're setting it up so that the individuals within those settings, because the primary goal is to gain their supervised hours, the only way those hours are going to count is if they comply with what our requirements are for supervision. Otherwise, the hours are not counting. So I think you're right. My sense when I look at all the surveys, et cetera, and the data, it doesn't looks like if we have any violators, it's a really small number. And we can't regulate, in my mind, or legislate for the onesies or the twosies. But we can certainly promote information so that associates, students, and interns can make an informed choice.
Actually, that's what I was going to say as well when I put my mic back on, was I think there's value to it even though we're not regulating it. I don't have any interest in getting into regulating this. We don't have the time to regulate what we have now. But I think there's a lot of value to providing that information to the trainees, to the, perhaps even some of the institutions that don't have those policies. I think that there's value in that.
And after all, because we are accepting their hours, so part of it, we do have some sort of, oversight right there. And I think, since we are in the part of the game, so setting, just, even providing those kind of resources, information, I think would be helpful, even to begin with. And so at least to keep our kind of hands, in the century. So, yeah.
Simply guidance for a lot of it.
Yes.
So,
in that case, public comments. We've been talking among ourselves. Hi, Dean.
Hi. I'm wondering if the survey included any of the online programs. Probably not, because they are out-of-state programs, but we have a lot of students in California that are getting their degrees in these online programs.
Just if they were listed, if they're a program we've evaluated, they would have been included. So if they're listed on our website, we would have contacted
I
them.
thought the website was no longer including out-of-state programs.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'd like, that's the list I used,
Right.
so I can't remember. I don't know if they were or not, I guess. But that is the
Yeah, I
list I
think the
used.
BBS is no longer evaluating out-of-state programs. So, which is understandable, and you do have a good relationship with California schools, but I'm just concerned about all the California residents and then applicants who are getting their degrees from these out-of-state schools, who seem to take no responsibility in finding practicum sites for their students here in California. Those students are just on their own to find a practicum site. We get a lot of requests at the Professional Association. They're hoping we will have a list of practicum sites from which they can choose. And of course, we don't feel that's our responsibility. In fact, the American Counseling Association ran an article in their magazine a couple of years ago saying that it is the ethical obligation of faculty to help their students find an appropriate practicum site, because we believe that this is part of the educational process. The university is giving units, so I don't think it's the board's responsibility to get too deeply into that. They regulate the internship, but not the practicum. So I don't know where you would interface here, but I did see the second bullet of the purposes of this committee was to strengthen the school practicum site and supervisors' responsibilities regarding placement and monitoring. And so that kind of made me think of this problem. Don't know what is appropriate to do about it, but
Dean, I'm not sure there's anything that we can do about it. I think that it's a buyer beware situation. Honestly, I think that if students are seeking online education for whatever life reason they have, it's still incumbent upon that student to do their due diligence to make sure that the education that they're paying for is going to meet the licensure requirements in California.
Yeah.
And practicum within the degree program is a requirement. And if you're seeking, if you're using an online school to get your education, it would behoove that student to take the next step and ask them about the practicum. And if they can't answer it to their satisfaction, then perhaps they need to consider another option.
yeah. And I don't think students are aware of that until they get right up to it, I'm wondering if, from the board's point of view, is there anything the board could require, like, do you ever see that agreement between the school and the supervisor, that four-way agreement? Or is that just something that is suggested? And
The four-way agreement, if I understand it, is suggested. It's not in law.
yeah,
Is it?
A written agreement is in law, but it doesn't specify a four-way agreement. It has to be between the school
And the
and the site, the
Okay.
school and the site.
but is there any follow-up on that?
No, we don't have those, we don't require those be submitted or anything.
You don't know if they have done it or not.
Yeah,
I
we
don't know if that would help shore up the online practicum sites that,
I have to say though, Dean, what you brought up is definitely a new trend because, it's not just about out of state, site, because, there are definitely some, big school, in Southern California will have satellite campus, up in Northern California. And then, whose responsibility to make sure that, those field of education are up to standard, so that's actually, really interesting. And, I got approached by, another MSW student, and, currently in California, but the school, it's taking is actually in Texas. So, so I think this is definitely a new trend, that you're, that what you brought up. But at the same time, now how many problems that we're running into right now. So that's why I'm thinking that, when we're talking about regulation, it might be a little bit too early. And yet, can we start by, giving examples, like we talked about, trying to at least to, put something together, put some parameters together, and then down the road that, if it's becoming really problematic, I think, we can, and at least give us some evidence, to start pursuing, heavier regulations to monitor, the emerging, problems.
I wonder if staff gets any inkling when they review the applications from the online schools, or whether they even know how good the practicum was or was not.
We're not going to know that.
No.
The exam will bear that out, whether they were properly trained or not. The exam
Say that again?
The exam will bear that out, whether they were properly trained. I think probably from, just an advocacy standpoint, Dean, I mean, I think that if your organization and any other organization representing the licensees wants to, put some advisory or caution or just, regarding online programs, yes, you can see why they're valuable, but understand that you still need to meet the requirements set forth in law. This includes practicum. Please, before signing on the dotted line, ask fully about that practicum program.
Yeah.
And I think that's the best we can do, because from the board standpoint, we don't regulate schools. We just don't. We establish what the curriculum will be, we establish what's required for licensure and what the training should include, et cetera. But for the board to take on regulating schools, that's a whole nother program. So, and quite frankly, it's a whole nother department, and it's more bandwidth than what I currently have.
NASW Genly Wong. I couldn't agree with Kim 100% or plus. There are too many schools for you to regulate, but not only that, it's really not your jurisdiction. It's not your cup of tea. A couple of things. What happens in social work is, first of all, the MSW supervisors of MSW students are not required to have a license unless it's related to the function of the field placement. So there are many, including NASW here in Sacramento, there are many practicum sites where there are no licensed personnel, and they're not needed. Our practicum here in Sacramento is a policy practicum, so we don't need a clinical supervisor. Secondly, the idea of regulating it or putting conditions has a downside, and that downside is you could actually decrease the number of practicum sites by putting conditions and, approvals and regulations. So you could have unintended consequences. If you start saying, well, you need to do this and you need to do that, then you'll have fewer sites that qualify. And that's opposite of what is needed. You need more sites, not fewer sites. And finally, I would really urge national accreditation that social work schools have. The Council on Social Work Education has been around since the mid-1950s, has done a tremendous job in kind of making uniform all of these requirements, has only in the last probably 5 years or so started to look at online MSW programs, which there are many. But some pioneering work was done recently by the California Association of Deans and Directors of Schools of Social Work. They represent the 24 MSW programs in California. They put together some preliminary guidance on practicum sites, how to find them, how they qualify, in particular, how they coordinate both online and non-online programs, which is a source of friction, as Dean mentioned. And they hope that this guidance that they developed will be adopted by the National Council and then applied to all schools across the country. Certainly the schools, the MSW programs in California, those that have online programs, are influenced by this guidance from the California Association of Deans and Directors. Thanks.
Thank you, Jan Lee.
David Jensen, Camp. First of all, Christy, thank you. Last night I didn't know to read Tolstoy or your memo. I will. No, awesome job. I think we got to remember, it's the job of the school to approve the site. I mean, that's the most fundamental principle here. So what attracted me to this committee was helping them understand how to make those decisions. And so the options that Christy's laid out, I actually think we're pretty close even on the first one. There's some things that probably could clean up, but it's really identifying the factors that would make something lawful and regular on the course. But think of the feedback we got from agencies and schools. They can identify sites that they're concerned about. To me, that shows the process is actually working. But I think you never want to say, no, not there, because in some communities that may be a huge source of clients, right, and clinical skills. So I think any standard's always got to be flexible, But it seems like the process is actually working, although we definitely need to, probably do more outreach and education in terms of what are the lawful and regular sites. So I'd like to see, that sort of be the emphasis. And to the extent we can help you, we're game for anything. Thank you.
Hi, Darlene.
Arlene Davis, Hope Counseling Center. I'm also a practicum instructor for about 12 years now at University of Phoenix and Alliant University. Not 12 years at Alliant, but 12 years at Phoenix. So I just wanted to say thank you for doing all of this too, because the practicum students are always giving me feedback. As you can imagine, they're at many sites. University of Phoenix is one of the biggest programs here of MFT students compared to some of the other schools. So I guess I could speak to our school and also from the students who speak with other students at their practicum site that go to different schools, that pretty much all the schools do have agreements, and they're pretty intensive. They cover the laws and the regulations that the BPS requires. They have evaluations multiple times during their practicum experience, the middle, at the end, that the practicum instructor has to fill out, that the site has to fill out. The student also evaluates the supervisor out at the site and the site in general. So that's in place. It is true what everyone has been saying, there's not enough sites. The students are constantly trying to find sites that will take trainees because the supervision ratio is so high. A lot of the sites can't offer enough supervision. Not to say that I think that supervision should go away, but that is an issue that's out there. I don't think it's the type of site, I think it's just the site. There are good sites and there are not so good sites. The one thing, in the online school, I am starting to take online students, and I'm very impressed. I think they have even higher standards. They are in communication with me more. The forms that I see that are filling out, that I have to fill out, seem to be even to a higher level, and that might be because they're COAMPT accredited, that require a higher standard, but so far impressed. The only thing I would ask as recommendations somehow is more communication, asking the sites and the schools to have more communication between the practicum instructor at school and the site supervisor. At Phoenix, they do tell us we have to do that, but I don't know that all the schools do, and I don't think it happens very often. So that was just my feedback.
You have a question, Betty?
Question for Darlene, but she walked away.
So I think, okay, should we really take a break? Okay, let's finish it. Okay.
Yeah, I just, I thought that was a valid point, the communication part, and that's not something we've talked about at all in this. How do you see that fitting into what we're doing today, and do you see that's part of the scope of what we're doing?
Well, it sounds like there were some recommendations maybe about the agreement that we want the sites to sign and the schools to sign together, that we have.
So adding that into a four-way of something?
Yeah, add that is a requirement, or I heard, though, if you
We can't
require it, it
require it,
has to be
yeah,
law, so, but a
absolutely.
guideline that they require it,
okay.
I think would be important.
Thanks.
Any other public comments? Okay, direction. So Christy, so looks like, having a definition of private practice is, seems like a kind of a consensus and a necessity. And then I think that, the next thing is, about, the examples or guidelines, or, about the four-way agreement, So do you think that, you will have a little bit more, to work on and maybe come up with, some languages that we can look at next time?
I think so, definitely. Now, did you want definitions for other types of sites? Because I think when we define private practice, depending how narrow we go, and I might give you a couple options, we still will have some sites that are not defined, that we don't have some sort of a label for. We don't know what to call them. So do we want to do that as well?
I think that let's work on that in the office. And if, once we kind of get through the definitions and see what settings it affects, if we have the outliers and take a look at that, one, to see if we really do need to define it, and two, if it's covered under what we already have. So, yeah, we'll bring back some options.
Something, yeah. But I also hate to make you work very hard.
It's okay.
I mean, because you have done so much.
Likes job security. I do know.
So, and then I think, just to reiterate, it's about the unintended consequences, whatever the language is. So that's, I just want to, say it out loud once more. Okay, so it looks like we can, close this topic number one. So let's take a quick 5 minutes break.
Thank you.
And so the time now is 10:20. Let's come back really fast, the latest. Okay, so welcome back to the Board of Behavioral Sciences Exempt Setting Committee meeting. So the time now, 10:31. So we're quite on time. So our next agenda item is the report on meeting with nonprofit and charitable organizations providing clinical mental health services. And it's Christy again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So in late January, some of us went down to Southern California and we met with 4 501c3 organizations where their primary function is providing clinical mental health services in the community. We, again, we don't have a lot of experience or knowledge about the different settings, and nonprofits are an exempt setting. We wanted to learn more about them because we had done this survey, and we also wanted to learn about the trainee fees and things like that. So we were very grateful to these 4 counseling centers that hosted us, and it was a wonderful experience. We learned so much, and they were very gracious and allowed us to just pick their brains, and came out of it with, feeling really good about the work that these places are doing in the community, and the clients they're serving is so important. A lot of their clients are from underserved communities, and we always hear, the Affordable Care Act has expanded mental health services, but some insurance policies are very high deductibles and copays that are not affordable. So most of these have sliding scale fees. Some clients pay $5. And some agencies provide services to undocumented individuals. They describe one population that they don't trust, like the system, so they may not want to go to a big company or whatever, or Kaiser or something, so they want to go somewhere like this that's in their community. They have a variety of services they provide. A couple of the clinics actually have a psychiatrist available as well. So these agencies are primarily funded by client fees, again, sliding scale, so it really restricts, although that's their number one, it's and it's consistent. It's the fees do not cover the service provided, obviously. So they rely a lot on individual donations, corporate donations, and although 2 of the agencies don't take government funding because they like to have the flex, usually government funding always comes with strings attached. So they prefer not to have those strings attached. So 2 of them do not take government funding. All of the agencies have an extensive training program for the pre-licensed students and the registrants, and they tend to focus in depth on clinical topics beyond what's covered in the schools. So one example they gave was training in trauma, because trauma focused, because that's a lot of the clients have that, and it's affecting them. And they bring in trainers from the outside a lot of times, people who are really respected, and so good quality there. Most of the supervisors for the students and registrants are off-site volunteers, because supervision can be very expensive to employ them. So 2 of the agencies use peer counselors in addition to the students and registrants, and they really emphasized how critical the peer counselors were to their programs, because they are able to reach clients that traditional therapists are unable to reach. And again, it's that lack of trust that they're able to bridge that because they come from the community. They have a similar, they try to recruit people who have a similar life experience or culture, or maybe they have, they speak 2 languages and they're able to communicate with this person who doesn't speak English very well, if at all. And they have an extensive training process for their peer counselors. One of the agencies has a 6-month program, I believe, right? And a certification that they do. And then the 4 agencies, they do a background check as they hire people, including fingerprinting as well. So,
Yeah, so we really had a wonderful experience, and as a result, we have Robert here attending. He was one of the individuals we met with, but there was a really good exchange of information back and forth, and I think we learned a lot from each other. And it all started because a couple of the agencies attended the Southern California meeting, and looking forward to that continuing partnership and collaboration so that we can continue to get information and exchange information and understand fully what's happening in the field. I left there feeling very confident. I would send anybody there to any 4 of those entities for treatment, knowing that they would get quality services from anybody there. So, and that was a nice feeling. That was really a nice feeling to have. So, thank you.
It's wonderful to hear that, that the staff do some fact-finding and bring back a pretty positive, impression of the agency. So thank you guys very much. And thank you, Robert, for being here too. Wonderful. So I don't think we require any action item. So I think we can move on to the 3rd topic, which is the survey result of exempt and private practice settings.
Yes. So we originally were going to bring this back at the last meeting, but we realized that as a result of some of the nonprofits attending this other meeting, that we maybe didn't get as many nonprofits responding to this survey as we had hoped. So we took it back. I was able to identify about another 200 people to contact to ask them to respond to the survey, and quite a few of them did respond. So I feel better now about the range of responses. I mean, we've got over 1,300 people responding to the survey. I feel really good about that.
Christy, can I ask, so what is the number of increase? I mean, I'm just trying to figure out.
We got about a little over 100 additional responses.
Oh,
so,
that's
yeah.
make a difference.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you.
Most definitely. So the full survey results are in the attachment. And so basically, just a little background, it was a voluntary and anonymous survey, and we asked for our licensees and registrants, as well as exempt setting agency directors to respond. So I'm going to go over the survey results. The first few questions of the survey we were trying to get some information about work settings just in general, because we knew developing some definitions. We thought, well, this would be a good place to gather some information. So the remainder of the survey was specific to exempt settings, and so that we were trying to determine, are there consumer protection issues? Are there, what's going on here? What kind of range of services are they providing? So I'll go over some of those notable results. Most of our survey respondents were LCSWs and LMFT licensees, 68%. The majority of the respondents were primarily working in a nonprofit and charitable entity. That's 28%. And we did have some private practice people respond, but that they wouldn't have continued with the exempt setting portion of the survey. And then you have a county or city agency of 14% of the respondents. They reported the main focus or purpose of these settings, of course, no surprise, are mental health clinic or counseling center. The other types of settings in the top 5 were a family or children's services program, a case management program, or a school setting. The vast majority of funding for these exempt settings comes from government, and the number 2 funding source is private payment. Of these, 36% of the respondents work in an exempt setting that allows clinical services to be provided by employees or volunteers who are not seeking licensure as a mental health professional. So we define clinical services as assessment, diagnosis, and/or treatment. So again, because it's an exempt setting, you don't have to be a student, a registrant, or a licensee. You can be anybody. You could, but as again we talked about, they use peer counselors, so that would be one example. So we really wanted to kind of get at that issue and get some more information about it. We asked that the remainder of the survey only be responded to by those who currently work in an exempt setting. So we had 244 people continue on, which is a great number as well. As I go on to this particular set of survey results, I'm going to use the term paraprofessional counselors to refer to those individuals who are not pursuing licensure but providing clinical services. So 38% of the respondents work in a region where there's a shortage of licensed mental health providers, so that's one factor of why you might use other types of unlicensed individuals. Although 67% said that their setting requires the paraprofessional counselors to somehow be license eligible, so at least have completed a degree program that is eligible for licensure. 17% of the settings require their paraprofessional counselors to have some personal experience, either as a mental health consumer or as a family member of a consumer. And that is important because, especially if you take Mental Health Services Act funding, that is a primary consideration for getting that funding. For the settings that specify educational requirements for their paraprofessional counselors, 46% either require a master's or a bachelor's degree at minimum. And one of our big questions was, do you feel the clinical services provided by those paraprofessional counselors, do they meet the same basic minimal standards as a clinical services provided by a licensee? And 54% felt that they do. 84% of the settings, of the exempt settings, require a fingerprint check for all individuals performing clinical services. 66% of the settings require a licensee to provide supervision to paraprofessional counselors, and in 61% of those settings, the supervisors have to work on site. And in 56% of the settings, they limit the number of supervisors, clinical supervisors, to at a 1-to-5 ratio. So a maximum of 5 supervisees per counselor. 85% of those settings have a formal mechanism for consumers to submit a complaint about their therapist, and 70% believe that those complaints are addressed appropriately. And that's important because, again, we don't regulate those settings, and we were interested in hearing, how the consumers were protected there. And then, so the big question at the end is asking their opinion. Do you believe certain settings should, well, we asked it in a negative. Do you believe that certain settings should not be continued to be exempted from mental health professional licensure requirements? So 37% said no, we shouldn't have exempt settings. 31% were not sure. The rest were yes, it's fine. But I think we can get a lot of insight on both sides of the issue. I list some of the written responses to this question. And because there were so many written responses, I sort of loosely categorized them. So in order of the frequency with which these topics came up. So we had 29 comments who said, no, the setting should not be exempt because it's lacking in clinical competence or in standards of care, and that there's a risk to consumers. Some of the yes responses were that, yes, they need to be exempt because there's a lack of funding for those types of settings. And there's, if we required licensees, well, not everybody can afford to get licensed either. So you're limiting who can provide services. And we already heard that paraprofessional counselors are important for certain reasons. Some of the yes responses were they should remain exempt because of the peer counselor issue. They're from the client's community. These are people who may not otherwise seek treatment at all. So some felt that settings should remain exempt because there is a shortage of licensed mental health professionals or willing or able to work in the setting or in that particular region. And we do know that we have regions that are designated as shortage areas by the state. Or actually the federal government, I believe, does that designation. And then you have people who said, yes, they should remain exempt, but there should be clinical supervision, training, or ethical standards for unlicensed staff. So your paraprofessional counselors, there's not an ethical code for them to follow that pertains to them specifically, although some of the sites might say, well, you've got to adhere to the CAMPT or something like that. And then some other no responses, it's a similar thing. It should not be exempt because most legal and ethical standards only apply to licensed or registered clinicians. And then it was kind of interesting, 15 of the individuals who wrote that no settings shouldn't be exempt were concerned about the exemption of school settings. And I'm not exactly sure the reasoning why. I read over some of those responses, but I think there may be a variation among schools, and maybe Deborah and Betty can fill us in a little bit. I think there may be some school districts that, smaller districts or in a rural area that maybe don't use credential, school or individuals who are licensed or credentialed to provide mental health services. I'm not exactly sure. Like, I know one of the nonprofits we work with or that we talk to send their counselors into the schools because they don't provide services, and they do it at no charge. So.
I'd like to respond, but I need to keep it absolutely diplomatic. And Deborah, I'm curious to hear your perception on this. There is a divergent experience. I mean, there's divergent training and experience between school counselors and what school counselors do and what mental health professionals do. And there's certainly some people who have the perception that some of the people that are doing counseling in schools should be licensed therapists as opposed to credentialed people. So I think that may be one of the little things that might have been underlying that. On the other hand, I can't address specifically whether there's people going into schools doing counseling who, it's my experience that if they're going into an accredited school, a public school, then they absolutely would have to have the appropriate credentials, unless they're under the auspices of some other agency. But there are non-public schools, private schools out there that probably have a lot of leeway in terms of what they can do, in terms of and who they use. But I'd like to hear Deborah's too.
Absolutely agree. I think the concern is that when or if these unlicensed therapists, because it's an exempt setting, enter the school, they're not necessarily credentialed under the credentialing law. They don't have a PPS or one of those. Is it the only recourse for a parent is to go to the principal. It is not to file with BBS. And so you're leaving the supervision, you're leaving any type of, what do I want to say, sanctions, or the only recourse, I suppose I would say, is that perhaps a student might complain to their parent. Their parent, then their recourse is to complain to the principal, and then the principal has the authority to hire and fire. But that's where it would end. It doesn't go any other, there's nowhere else to go. You're finished. So I think that, and there are agencies, I only speak for the rural areas, that do use the schools as where they send their associates to get their training is on those campuses. And sometimes those entities don't even know their associates. They have been billed as completed therapists. They are not actually told. So I think the bigger issue is if in fact there is some type of inappropriate behavior, and that the place that you would be able to go and get remedy would be just the head of the school. And I'm not sure that when, at least sitting on this board, looking at it from our charge, that is enough. That's up to the principal, and the principal is whether the principal has the wherewithal to know about mental health and whether or not there's been anything actually done incorrectly. But I want to just tag on to Betty. There is a big, because of the mental health issue, the PPS credential is not in mental health counseling. It is for career. And those counselors are becoming very cognizant about the fact that they're trying to separate that line. And they don't want to do crisis counseling. That's not what they're trained in. They're trained in helping you get into college and selecting your next classes. And so when those start crossing over, at least I'll only speak from the experience that I've had, that's when we had to hire a separate agency to bring in therapists that actually would be able to do the job that was needed to be done. And the counselors were backing off, as they should. They are not registered, licensed mental therapists. They have a teaching, not a teaching, but a PPS credential. They don't even have a teaching credential. But it allows them to do certain things, and they're becoming very aware that they need not, especially with suicide and all of the other things that are facing school right now, to step aside and no longer take that the approach that probably we had when we were in school. Those counselors could do everything. They could be your crisis counselor, they could be your career counselor. They had, I think, a bigger breadth to work with under. But I think now, I know, can only speak for the counselors that I know, they're making sure that they're tread very carefully. And I'm seeing it more often than not that they are now contracting with mental health providers on the outside so that they bring in the appropriate people to handle those things. The only problem is that costs money. And so you get a counselor, at least just in our case, twice a week. So you've got almost 1,000 students, and you get a counselor 4 hours 2 times a week. So hold it, I hear you, but you're going to have to wait because the others, otherwise then it's CPS or 911, 5150 type of thing. So that, I think, is the only concern, is that we make sure that, I should just say for myself, is that within the exempt settings, that, and school is one of them, that those that can get their MFTs, right, their marriage and family, at least their master's degree in counseling, could actually come in and be quasi-therapists, but not be licensed with this board. And their only recourse as a parent with a minor, these are all minors in school, their only recourse is to go to the principal. And then that principal ends up being the one who is judge and jury on whether or not any mental health violations have occurred. And then they either keep them or they fire them. And that's the only concern that I have, is that parents, especially with minors, should have something more than a principal to have those conversations with. So,
Thank you, Deb. And
I've been waiting for a long time to get to say that.
So
now you have the floor.
Just a point of clarification, because I know your experience is at the high school. And the high school does typically have guidance counselors whose specialization is career. It is. However, a PPS credential also allows for counseling. And at the elementary level, those counselors are in fact working as counselors, not as guidance counselors. So there's two different types of specialties within that PPS credential. I have a PPS credential. It's not in guidance. It's not in course selection. It's in counseling. I'm also a school psychologist, but that's beside the point. But I didn't want people to leave with the idea that a PPS counselor can't provide counseling. They can, and they do, and they do a good job of it. They don't provide therapy. They provide counseling. As part of the crisis teams now typically include a counselor as part of their crisis response team on a school site, and all school sites are required to have a crisis or suicide plan, response plan. Anyway, I divert, but just wanted to clarify the PPS piece.
Dean, go ahead.
Yes, there are LPCCs who are preparing to work in the schools. Some of them already have a PPS credential and they're getting the additional coursework. And this is an ideal situation if your PPS credential people also have the LPCC license, then you only have to pay one person. You don't have to bring in additional people to do the mental health counseling. So there are these counselors in the pipeline, and in fact, some of our LPCC interns are getting their hours in the schools, and then the issue gets to be, who do you have on site to supervise them? So they are getting off-site supervisors and getting their hours in the schools that allow them to do mental health counseling. And this seems to vary by the school district. So we run into this with our members quite often. But when we went for the LPCC, that umbrella was meant to include school counselors who could meet the LPCC requirements. There are also, and I think I've mentioned this before, there is a school-based mental health program statewide. I don't know how many districts have adopted this program, but that's ideal because they have licensed supervisors available so that LPCCs can do their internships in the schools and they can do mental health counseling under supervision. So that's kind of a new idea, I think.
If you could, you're absolutely correct, and I'm seeing that going more and more that way, and I think if your organization could say, hey, have you thought of this? Because that's the perfect world. You're that person who can do it all. And you're licensed over here, and you're also licensed, or I shouldn't say licensed, but credentialed through the state in another way, so that parents feel very comfortable sending their child into that counselor.
Yes.
Whether it be, I want to go to Stanford or Cal Berkeley, and I can help you that way, or whether or not we've got a student in crisis with an eating disorder that we need to help. It doesn't matter. I can see everybody, and I don't have to parcel out what's going on. And as a parent, you feel so confident that there's recourse somewhere, so they've got to be good. You know, there's something we can do about it if they aren't good. And it's above and beyond the top of the person who works at the school. It's at the state level. Same with the teaching credential. I mean, the principal can, hire you. That's a whole nother ball game. Yeah. But people have the right, parents have the right to report a teacher's credential, whether the principal likes it or not. And that's, I think, the reassurance that I've heard from parents. because teachers are now, as a horrible incident last week, are acting as everything. They are everything to these students now. And so even teachers want to feel confident that when they're sending them to this guidance counselor, or whether it be a crisis counselor, that our students have access to help. And that's not necessarily the case on every campus.
So the more licensed counselors we can get on the campuses, the better. And I think we're going in that direction. However, the universities are offering a 48 unit master's for the PPS credential, but then they're also offering a 60 unit master's for the LPCC. So students will be making their choice as to what direction. Now, how this plays out at the school site, I'm not sure, but it sounds like there may be a division of what each type is able to do.
And it depends on what department in the university they're both hanging out in.
The university, or I'm thinking of the school site.
Oh, okay.
How do they differentiate between a PPS credentialed person and an LPCC licensed
Well,
person?
you would put it on your resume that you have
as to-
both.
Yeah, well, that's not quite what I was
Oh.
saying. It comes to the job description at the school site is
Right.
what how do we differentiate between the PPS academic advisement counselors and those who are mental health licensed people? Because it looks like maybe we'll be having both.
Yes.
Ideally, you've got one person who's got both. But what I'm saying is the schools are still producing the PPS folks.
In a perfect world, a person would play both roles.
Yes.
But in schools that like Ms. Connolly was saying, that there's options which way you want to go on that PPS. And it depends on whether you're at the elementary K through 8 level or you're at the high school level. Because in the K through 8, they don't necessarily need career. See, she's shaking. No, we don't need career counselors at that level, but we do at the high school level, and typically that's what comes through the door. There's nothing to say that they can't go out and get an MFT or an LPCC on top of that, and there's nothing to say that the school can't hire an LPCC to augment the 2 credentialed career counselors. I think schools right now are trying to figure out how they can have it all with the least amount of money. And, but if the universities took advantage of this crisis that we have, the best candidate, and I can only speak for the high school level, the best candidate at the high school level would have both.
Right.
And so if there were programs that overlapped one another, you'd be putting out the perfect candidate, at least at the high school level. So.
And I think that's happening as I talk with faculty. Some courses are for both PPS and LPCC students, and then those who are going the extra mile for the license take these courses. So that's how it's playing out. And
My hat's off to all of those high schools that have clearly made drawn the line between counseling and mental health, and they're not trying to do both of it, and they're really leaning on the administration to go out there and contract. If you're not going to hire one, then go out there and contract with some type of a facility that will bring them in on campus, because it's an absolute need. And that's how it's all about money with everything. So that's where we are with that. I think that the tide will start to change a little, and I think you're going to see that person who wants to be the career person also want to be the crisis counselor at the same time. And hopefully, at the end of the day, they're just going to have they'll have one credential and they'll have one license. And that'll just make them more
since
marketable.
we don't allow them to add on assessment and diagnosis anymore, they're going to have to make that decision before they get their degree.
Oh,
Okay,
that's true.
we're going off topic now. It's kind of like going off further off the tangent. I know, right? So, all right, Jen Lee.
Jan Lee Wong, NASW. Just want to make a few comments. First of all, generally speaking, to provide therapy to students, you need parental consent. There are a few exceptions, but in general. So parents are already aware if their child is going to get therapy because of the parental consent. There are some exceptions, granted, but that's in general. Secondly, all school personnel, pretty much all, most are mandatory reporters.
Yep.
So you don't have to be licensed to be a mandatory reporter. You can be a teacher, you can be a principal, you can be a vice principal. So if there's any inappropriate activity going on, such as sexual abuse or some sort of improper conduct, sexual harassment, for example, that could be reported as child abuse. And that's a mandatory report. Secondly, the credentialed staff also include a school social worker. So it's not just counselors.
Yeah.
And the school social worker does do counseling, psychosocial counseling. They make home visits. They do stuff in the community. They aren't necessarily therapists, although they could be, particularly if they have a license. And a good example of the larger school districts, for example, LA Unified has an entire department of licensed or registered associate therapists that they spread out among all the schools in LA Unified. So it's a huge department at LA Unified. And of course, you can go to the opposite example of the smallest school district where they have no staff. That's just the way it is in terms of size. Generally, schools are going to want licensed staff to provide therapy. One of the biggest reasons, somebody already mentioned it, is payment or reimbursement, especially if it's Medicaid. So they're not going to use non-licensed staff who aren't qualified for Medicaid reimbursement or some other reimbursement. The other area that we didn't mention is school psychologists. There's actually regulations that require school districts to have a ratio of school psychologists. Now, I know most of us realize that there's also a huge sort of variation in school psychologists, starting with the LEPs, but there's also clinical psychologists that are hired by school districts too. So that's another part of the equation. And then finally, just my own experience, which is, I don't think that unchanged, is when I went to high school, I saw my career counselor once when I was a senior for about 15 minutes. And he told me he had like 300 on his caseload to see during the course of the year. And there's no way that person is a very nice counselor, very dedicated. He could not do therapy and career counseling at the same time. It's just not, he couldn't do it, Finally, a lot of schools do not have the proper facilities for private therapy. They're using every inch, every square foot of the school for anything and everything, and they just don't have private offices for therapy. So I wanted to throw that out there. If you're really interested in this topic, which I think is important and very interesting, you might want to consider in the future kind of inviting some people to come and make a presentation to you who work in the schools, who are either administrators, clinicians, counselors, teachers, etc. It's a whole world into itself.
Oh, yes.
It's a huge world. Thank you.
So Jenny, you can probably, down our, agenda items, and you can make that proposal.
Yeah.
Officially. Okay. So, Christy, you have some feedback?
Yeah, so, what I wanted to get to is the recommendation. The whole purpose for the exempt setting committee, this survey was really sort of the foundation for the purpose of why this committee was created, to determine if there were consumer harm occurring in these exempt settings. So, after looking at the results of this survey, it's now up to the committee, do we want to delve into any of these issues further, and look at possible developing any standards and the possible impacts of those options, or where are you at based on these survey results?
Okay, so my 2 cents on that would be, let's roll that into the definition. Let's use some of the results to help really clarify our definitions. Like, it really struck me as, a formal mechanism for complaints for consumers. I thought that was kind of an interesting idea for a nonprofit, if they want to be exempt.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. Definitely, I like the idea of the mental health professional to supervise the paraprofessionals or the peer counselors. I also liked, how's the other one? 2. I mean, those 2 just struck me as reasonably non-invasive guidelines that we could strongly encourage the nonprofits to do, because as we found out a month ago, I mean, most of them are doing it anyway, but it just sort of puts it out there. Or maybe a nonprofit that's not doing that to go, oh, maybe I should, that's a good idea, maybe I can do that. So I think that's stuff that we could work on and bring that back.
So I want to also tag on to what Kim said too, so for that question number 13, that item number 10, on the survey results, that is a really interesting statement, result, that 54% that the clinical services provided by a paraprofessional counselor typically do meet the same basic minimum standard. I'm like, wow, this is interesting. So, so if we go, if we can, just maybe set some standard, is a paraprofessional doing the same job as the licensed or registrant, or who are those people?
That's your peer counselors, that's
Right.
through the MHSA, and
Exactly.
my understanding is that they're members of the community to sort of bridge between the service and the community to get the services out there.
Right.
Sort of that client's advocate.
Right.
But the training, in fact, when we were meeting with the group last month, there's a 6-month training program that they go through. They don't see anybody until they've been through that training. And then there's some limits and such. But I don't want, honestly, peer counselors, don't want to go there.
No. So I actually work in that setting, because,
Right.
I am, working for the MHSA and, the drop-in
Right.
center and work with a peer counselor all the time. So, so I think, different setting will provide different standard. But what I'm more concerned is not the peer counselor. If I look at the question that those paraprofessionals are, what we mean by the clinical services is really equivalent, to the registrant and the licensee. And then half of them, said that they meet the standard, but half of them say don't. Yeah.
I'm over here jumping.
Yeah,
Because
go,
I had
talk.
the exact same note.
Yes.
But my thought is, at the end of the day, we don't have jurisdiction over these settings. So this comes back to the original issue that we had all along, which is, it's frustrating because we see people presenting themselves as counselors, doing the work of counselors, possibly even some of our licensees that have had their licenses revoked are now practicing
As a life coach.
in other settings, in some pseudo counseling, probably calling themselves counselors. They can call
Probably.
themselves anything they want, but we can't do anything about
Not
it
until it comes to our attention, and then it becomes unlicensed.
unless they're actually calling themselves,
Right.
unless they're actually purporting to have a license. So I guess my frustration over here is this just confirmed to me all of the concerns that we've had all along.
Right.
That 50% of people are providing clinical services in a setting without any supervision whatsoever. And yet,
So that means that, lead to the more, that we need to definitely, work on this, and maybe we need to, move forward to, to set some standards, to regulate. I hear you, but that's the trouble.
How can we regulate a setting over which we have no jurisdiction?
Right?
That's my point, yeah.
Yeah.
But I wonder if there might be some ways that we do a little research and maybe, say you have the individual who has had some BBS discipline and goes and practices in one of these exempt settings, maybe there's some way to say that that person can't do that. This is just an example, I'm not saying we do this, but, and you don't go after the setting necessarily, but that person.
Right.
Some way that we write that, you know what I mean? There might be some ways like that we can address some of these issues where it's the individual. But again, I realize we can't, find a setting, or, you know what I mean?
So, yes.
Or unless we wanted to get into that business, but I don't think that's
Right.
not our,
Right. So that's exactly, come right back to square one. It's like, we know that there's, it confirmed that, it is a problem. And yet, how do we, address this issue, so that we can protect the public? And then for the unlicensed people, that they are not also, telling their clients that I am doing diagnosis and assessments and treatment, just like a licensee. So I think that's the really, the way to go. So the other, sorry, Kim,
Let
go
me,
ahead.
because a lot of the students or the trainees, interns, associates are getting clinical hours in those settings, right? So maybe we think about defining what an acceptable exempt setting would be if the individual is collecting hours, as opposed to, because there's no, Craigslist, you could go into Craigslist and advertise counseling services, and people, can respond, but I think part of the other component to any of this is that we need to do a better job of educating consumers about what is an appropriate setting to get services from. If you're walking into somebody's apartment and going into the second bedroom for services, that might not be an acceptable setting if you can't verify that individual's license. So it's a really big piece of the pie to digest, but I know.
Yeah.
I know. I know. So I think I'm hearing all the concerns, and I think that maybe we can go back and staff, and we can kind of collaborate and put our brains together, and maybe bring back something that sketches out a solution that doesn't adversely impact the entities that are doing it correctly, but does provide a mechanism for us to maybe identify those that aren't, and maybe the individuals that are providing those services. Yeah, I don't know. I can try.
That's good.
Perhaps, Kim, we can use our website and our newsletter to educate the consumers on good questions to ask.
Right.
If it's about the individual and not the setting, then we need to provide them a checklist. To be a good consumer, you might want to ask these questions.
Right.
And if you get these answers, you might not want to pursue that goal. But I think that's a great idea. Instead of going after the settings, people are doing the right thing. Right. And if the client were to ask those questions, they would get the appropriate answers and they could move forward. But if they don't, that's our job, right? That's our job, is to protect the consumer. So if we're going to protect them, we have to give them the tools so that they can ask, so that they are learned consumers. But if we don't give them those tools, then they're just kind of left to hang out there.
It's like issuing kind of like a consumer report, here's the standard of buying a car. So, yeah. Yeah. So I know Alon has been waiting. So Dean, if you don't. Is it, oh, sorry, it's Jeffrey.
Sorry, it's okay. Betty took exactly enforcement authority.
That's why you sit down. I thought you were waiting too long. Sorry, Jeffrey, I confused your names. Yeah, go ahead, Dean.
I just have a very naive question, which is, it's unlawful to provide psychotherapy unless you're registered or licensed. Why do we have these agencies who are exempt from that law?
Hence the establishment of this committee. We don't know. Honestly, we don't. I don't even know how we got here. Christy's got probably a general idea, but I know that there are groups out here in Sacramento that set up mindfulness centers, spiritual awareness, and you can come and they have just an undergraduate degree in psychology, and they're providing services that they are aware of up until that educational level. People are buying into it because it's a self-help center. So I don't know. It's
maybe we need to define psychotherapy.
We have.
And so maybe you can do some things with a paraprofessional or a peer counselor to a certain level that is not considered psychotherapy.
But the challenge gets when you've revoked a license, the individual's trained, and they still have the skill sets, and they can still go out there and do it. So, if they hide in an exempt setting, it's not reputable, then there's a problem.
That's not good public protection.
We would agree, but that's why we're grappling with
So this
it.
is the nut of the problem. We need to just focus in on that.
I think what you're talking about is not exempt settings. Those are just the classification what people are calling themselves. I thought this was actually the committee was going to work on that too, but that would be redefining the scope of practice, which is incredible. But how do you differentiate between a life coach and an actual licensed therapist? It's a very fine line.
I actually really like that idea too, because, once we closely, define what really we're talking about, then at least you can go from the surface level, to differentiate those who are paraprofessional or, who are those people. Now you just have a pot of jambalaya. So, yeah. And Jeffrey.
Thank you. Just like everyone's saying, though, as some of these professionals or people that have lost their license for whatever reason, they can go out and start a mindfulness organization and do actual therapy. I think that's the exact reason why we need this kind of public protection of helping consumers figure out what they're getting into. I can go describe myself as anything on Craigslist, and if a consumer can say, does Jeff meet A, B, and C? Is that an actual person I should go see? That seems like that's the only way you can get around it at this point. Thank you.
I think just providing better consumer guidance on a lot of that, and maybe defining the terms that we see commonly. What is a life coach? Generally somebody who's not licensed.
And possibly the consequences, if you're practicing, psychotherapy, since it's clearly defined, what will the consequences be?
A fine from us, and then referral for criminal prosecution.
Citation, publish?
No, well, we get them a citation, but if you run it through the court system, it can be up to a $25,000 fine.
Wow.
Because they're taking money. Yeah, they could, So
do we have, Roseanne and Christy, you do think that you have clear direction, where to go from here?
I mean, we're gonna try our best to, keep in mind consumer protection and some of the concerns that are in here, and maybe talk with legal a little bit too, talk with counsel about what, how we can maybe do some of this. I really love the idea of developing some sort of brochure for consumers. I think that would go a long way toward consumer protection. But we can definitely explore some ideas and how those things might be able to be enforced versus things that maybe put on the books but not do anything with.
So if for the exam setting, I really think that, the definition, like him said, the definition is pretty important. Because once we well define, what really, should be the exempt and not exempt, and what is the mental health exempt, and I think, we will probably, have a little bit clearer angle, where we can, where we can try to, introduce legislation. Because right now, like Betty, frustration is that there's nothing you can do, and yet, I think right for now, let's just breathe. But I do believe that, once we have a clearer picture of what we're dealing with, then maybe we find a solution.
So, well, we'll put our thinking caps on and
Creative
see how
design.
see what we come back with. Yeah.
Okay, sounds really good. So, okay. Any other discussion or suggestion from the stakeholders? Okay, thank you very much. So the next one is the temp staffing agency.
Yes, so this came up through this committee because we have, we talked about this back last year, and we were asked to bring some possible language back. So we have a lot of times it's ASWs, and they're gaining experience while employed by a temp agency, and this is often seen with registrants placed at the VA. So there, the VA has a shortage, so they go to a temp agency to quickly bring in some therapists. The problem is that it's not a good fit with our current law. There are some provisions in our law that don't make sense with the employer being a temp agency. So we talked about these issues and came up with some solutions. So I've got some language for you. So I'm just going to, since it's been a while, let's go over them again pretty quickly. The first issue was that temp agencies can more often, we see this more often there than other times, they employ someone as an independent contractor, a registrant, and that's prohibited. And so we decided not to do anything with that legally other than better educate supervisees and supervisors that that type of employment arrangement is prohibited and that any hours gained will not count toward licensure. Other than that, there's one minor exception in law for volunteers getting reimbursed for expenses. So that's the direction we were taking there. The location of services performed was an issue. The current law for LMFT and LPCC requires trainees, associates, and applicants. So sometimes you have applicants for licensure who are no longer a registrant, but they might be in an exempt setting. So that the law addresses them as well. So the law requires them to perform services at the place where their employer regularly conducts business. Well, obviously, you're not going to provide services at a temp agency. So now, just to throw a little wrench in here, AB 93, pending legislation, is changing this law a little bit. But basically, where we landed is that in the case of a temp agency employer, the law should say that the registrants must perform services at the agency where they've been placed. So that's where we landed there. Then the law goes on to specify that. So this is where AB 93 is deleting some language. So I think we can just skip over that. That's kind of a moot point, but I wanted to make sure you were informed about that. So there's a situation where there's a written agreement required between the employment and supervisor, and that goes for the three professions. I'm going to use the term outside supervisor to describe a supervisor who is either not employed by the supervisee's employer or is a volunteer supervisor in some way. And again, this part of the law is being amended by AB 93, and it's going to make it consistent for all of the professions because it's written just a little differently right now. So basically, an outside supervisor has to sign a written agreement with the employer to take supervisory responsibility for the supervisee's services. And the reason for this agreement is consumer protection is the main reason. So that the agreement has to ensure the supervisor has access to client records. It prohibits the employer from interfering with the supervisor's legal and ethical obligations and to ensure compliance with licensure requirements. So then, in the case of a temp agency employer, we determine that the written agreement should instead be between the agency that has responsibility for the clients and the supervisor. Because the temp agency, it makes no sense. They don't have anything to do with the clients. And okay, so then we also have the written agreement after AB 93 passes, and also in current LCSW law, where the supervisor and the supervisee have different employers, a written agreement is required. But sometimes your supervisor is already employee of the site where the registrant's being placed. They have different employers, but the supervisor is already working at the agency who has responsibility for the clients. So there's no need in that situation for a written agreement. They've already got access to client records. They already are not going to, they work for the same, the supervisor works for the employer where the registrant's being placed. So in that case, the fit with current law is not working. So in that situation, the written agreement we determined would not be necessary. So I didn't want to draft exact language yet because AB 93 is pending. I did draft some conceptual language in attachment D, and I'd have to work with counsel on this. I think it could be in regulation, but I'm not 100% sure that all of this could fit there. Basically, we would define what a temporary employment agency is and what the contracting agency is, which would be where they've been placed. And then we would say if the trainee, registrant, or applicant for licensure has a temp agency employer, that they must only perform services at the places where the contracting agency regularly conducts business, and that the agreement shall be between the contracting agency and the supervisor, and when the supervisor is an employee of that agency, no written agreement shall be required. So just kind of wanted to bring this back and not wait until AB 93 passes, and then, so much more time is going to pass. I just wanted to at least get this concept by you guys, and then once the bill passes, we can draft the actual language.
And again, thank you so much for bringing the language in. It's always better, to have something in hand. So I really like the definition. It's pretty clean and, and describe, exactly, what we discussed about. So I like it. Yeah. Any other feedback from the board members? No? Public comments. Any stakeholders? Jan Lee?
Jan Lee Wong, NASW. A little concerned about the language regarding location of services performed. That's a traditional definition that the employer has an office, the employee works in the office. That's where services are provided. In today's world, that's changing quite a bit. But in clinical social work, it's never been restricted to the office of the employer. And often clinical social workers are out in the field, they're out in the community, they're in the homes, they're in a number of locations that don't belong to the employer. If you work for a county, for example, you may be located in a place that is not owned by the county. So you need to think about making this a little bit more flexible to reflect kind of the situation now. I read somewhere, I'm not recommending it, I haven't read enough about it, but I've read somewhere where some people are doing therapy with clients by taking a walk in the park. I read that somewhere. I'm thinking, how could you do that, especially like in Central Park or someplace? But I wouldn't condemn it necessarily. I would just say, well, what are the pros and cons? What have been some of the problems with that? Because the goal here is really to deliver services to clients, not to define, well, you must do it in this office and this office must be located in this place. So if a client can get treatment that benefits them in an alternative setting, I'm not sure that
Well, so
Yeah.
that statement there I actually pulled that out of the language in the bill. And we had a discussion about this because it says the places where the contracting agency regularly conducts business. So that, in the discussions about that, it's felt that covers anywhere that agency regularly does business, meaning if their therapists go out and does business in the community, they do services in the community, that covers that. So this is not intended to be restrictive.
Right.
And it does mirror the language that's in AB 93.
So does it have a reference about, what is the standard industry acceptable practice? Say like, Jenny is right, because, especially for the MHSA practice, then, when they encouraging health and wellness, then, it might be a service, a clinical service that not necessarily just confined in the office. So I'm just wondering, either, if we take that into consideration, we can either clarify the language or, reference in another section of it, of the practice, then to add some clarity. Make it so not confined.
Yeah, I think, since it's just a conception right now, I think in general, we're just kind of looking for guidance. Because I do recognize Jan Lee's concerns. I also see my analyst from the social work unit who's probably just itching to jump on this and provide a little bit of a comment. But before we definitely want to work with everyone, and that's always our intent. So, I'm going to.
Hi, Darlene.
Yeah.
Darlene York, BBS. Okay, so one of the concerns that I have is a lot of times with these staffing agencies, an applicant will say, I'm being placed here, the supervisor works there, but no, I'm paying them privately to supervise me after work in another location, but without the employer's knowledge. And we see this a lot. And I said, well, if you're not getting an agreement from your employer, then chances are it's not approved, because we want it to be an approved, setting. And if they're doing something off-site, and a lot of people believe off-site is just because it's out of the location. We just, off-site to us is the supervisor might not be employed there, but in this particular case, which is quite often, the supervisor is employed there, but they're wanting to do it out of the employment setting. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah. And one of the in our regulations, it says where Jan Lee was speaking about maybe seeing people in different locations. It just says that the employer is where they lawfully, see their clients. And what we tell people is because those agencies are the custodians of those, files, records, whether they're, different subdivisions or, whatever, but that's how we see it as far as they have the authority over those client files, wherever they're at, in the park, in the coffee shop. But that's just my opinion. Thank you.
Thanks, Darlene.
Excuse my voice.
So definitely a work in progress.
Yes, definitely, but it's good foundation.
Yeah, I always like the additional language. We can send to other places as long as it's under direction and control, right, of the employer, the supervisor. I think about setting like a church, maybe one-time deal. They've got a new group of young married couples, and they want to do 10 weeks, on marital communication, counseling, sort of thing. Well, if it's only a one-time deal, am I regularly conducting business then? So to me, that would fail the current test we have, but it wouldn't have been applicable under the old test because the employer is sending them out to that church to do that 10, week thing of counseling. So I like more of the flexibility sort of approach. I'm always trying to encourage our members to think outside the 90847 box and what other sorts of services, can you provide to the community. And, churches, even, employers might have counseling sorts of things. And what always made it safe for me was I'm the employer, I know what's going on, I'm contracting with that entity, we're sending you guys out there to do that work. So to me, I don't know that we gain much by taking away that second prong, the sending out under direction and control, because I think this forecloses those sorts of one-time kinds of things that might pop up that we could do some good in the community for. Thanks.
I had a question. So you're talking about in the legislation where we're deleting some language about under the, including performing services at other locations, as long as the services are performed under the direction and control of the supervisor.
Right, I think that allows for the flexibility there.
Okay, gotcha.
Thank you so much. Okay. So I guess that another pool of feedback taken, and let the staff take it from there. Okay. Thank you so much, Christy. All right. So we have the last agenda item, discussion regarding a licensed master of social work employees billing as psychotherapist. And Christy.
So there's been a concern raised about some of the billing practices that are happening in exempt settings that employ social work students. So they're not, they're in their master's program, so those are titled social work interns. So agencies sometimes bill for the student as a psychotherapist, using that term. Sometimes the bill will include the supervisor's name, but not the student's name. Sometimes the bill does list the student's name, but it doesn't disclose that the provider was a student. And agencies commonly bill for student-provided services at the same rate as a licensed individual. So they could be doing, clinical work, but bill at that same rate as if the person was licensed. And so some of the concern may be, does this imply to the client or whoever's paying the bill that this was a licensed psychotherapist? So our current law pertaining to social work, and this may be a bigger issue than just social work, but that was the context in which it was brought to us. There's an exemption in the law for social work interns being allowed to perform services as long as it's supervised by the academic setting. So, but it also goes on to state, and that those persons are designated by such titles as social work interns, social work trainees, or other titles clearly indicating their status appropriate to their level of training. We have similar law in the LMFT and LPCC statutes. The law does not explicitly address billing, but it does imply that if a title is used, it has to clearly designate the status. So that's the issue. I wanted to present it initially here to for discussion and thoughts on it.
Any question from the board members? I guess, it is a bigger question is, if, I'm just thinking about private practice, if private practice is defined as, seeing the person and also the reimbursement. So, and also if the students are in training, they're not the registrant, they're at the very beginning, are they qualified to provide the services, up to the level of, the psychotherapist. So I think that's probably, it applies to all licensees. Jan Lee?
Jan Lee Wong, NASW. Well, if an LCSW works for the county in Northern California adjacent to Butte, and if that LCSW has MSW interns in the program, and those MSW interns see clients, then that supervision of the LCSW, as well as the multiple layers within the county, should be sufficient to provide some oversight, some consumer protection. Also, that county has multiple complaint procedures and processes too, so it's not like without it. Now, what we're really talking about here is not the title. That MSW student is an intern, should not have the title of psychotherapist, but they are providing psychotherapy services. So I think it's important not to confuse the two, because if you start saying, well, students should not provide psychotherapy services, I think you're going down a very difficult road, and I believe my colleagues would have a problem with that too, especially since they can gain hours from their students providing therapy services. Thank you.
Thanks for the clarification. I think that's a very, if what I just said that confused everybody, that's very important to point to clarify. I don't think, the problem is about, students providing psychotherapy. It's whether, the services, provided, while they're in training that can be billed as a full psychotherapist. I think that's a very important discussion, applied to, all licensees. And I'm curious, Kim, you go ahead.
Yeah, it sounds like it's a billing issue. And I naively believe, and if I'm right, blind squirrel, the insurance company sets the codes under which you can bill, correct? So it seems like if there's a concern because a trainee or a student or an associate is providing services under supervision, but the mechanism to bill for those codes is only under the license of the supervisor, it seems like it needs to be straightened out at the insurance level and not at ours. Because the services are being delivered legally. You've got someone who's either in school or registered with us. In both of those scenarios, they're registered. It's how they gain their hours to qualify for the licensure exams. So it's legally, from our perspective, it's appropriate. But to me, it seems like it's a better question for an insurance company and working it out with them. And maybe they want to change their codes, and maybe they don't. I don't know. But I know that one of the things that the students and anybody providing those services has to do is they have to identify who they are and who they're under the supervision of. And then that informs the client as to who's providing the services.
Roseanne?
Forgive my lack of knowledge. I don't know a lot about billing codes, but is there another code that's available for them to bill a trainee under or an intern? Do they have to either bill them as a psychotherapist or not bill them at all? And that's the option. And who's in charge of setting that code?
Well, got to say insurance company, because you can't my guess is you cannot get payment if you don't code it correctly. And if we think back a few years ago, one of the reasons that a lot of, the first thing that comes to mind is art therapists and drug and alcohol counselors want to have licensure is so that they can bill insurance companies, because with a certification you can't.
Basically, they all have to bill under a psychotherapist.
Some type of licensure or some kind of code. So in terms of our lens and what we have authority over, I don't see this as our issue. Oh,
I'm curious about what the the practice in the out whether the students actually are not required, but part of the training is to practice providing services, and then the agency would benefit from from the claims, and because I assume that a lot of the students are non-paid, and then they come in and provide the services, and then the claim that is a psychotherapist, and then the agency receive the services. So I don't know, maybe educate me. Yeah.
So Jeffrey Liebert, AMFT, California. My experience working, I actually worked in a school setting as an intern. And my experience was that I had no control, no conversation about billing whatsoever. So it was my responsibility to provide the services to the standards that was set forth, and the agency took care of the billing. If they billed me as a psychotherapist, I had no idea. So I like kind of what you're getting at, Kim, that it's hard to regulate that, because where does the fault land in that, if anything? And also it sounds like it's almost like a fraudulent issue on the insurance side with billing, rather than something that you guys would take care of on your end. And I would imagine that if an insurance company had the opportunity to pay an intern less, that they would make a code for that.
Darlene Davis. Yeah, I think you're right on, Kim, that I have seen and heard of agencies that bill regular insurance companies and their intern or associates doing the work. And I always ask the question, how do you guys do that? How are you doing that? I think it's fraud. As far as the county contracts for Medi-Cal, you have to be a LPHA, licensed professional of the healing arts. I think it's been a while since I worked in public mental health, but and so they are regulated by you. But there are codes for case management or rehabilitation they can bill Medi-Cal for, and those can be bachelor level people, but it's not psychotherapy.
Right, right. So, yeah, so that, that, I guess that, the question is that, if they are providing psychotherapists, whether it constitute fraudulent, because, especially the student, they don't have the registration, so registration number or the license, because I'm thinking that, on the same token, if let's say, it's an unlicensed person, practice psychotherapy, right? And provided a claim, whether it's, never mind. I'll take it back.
Yeah, I think it's a good question for the insurance company and billing. I really do. I mean, but we're not going to get the students or the associates trained unless they can provide those services. And if somebody is billing insurance and the requirement is, you typically, I know medical personnel have to have a provider number. I believe our therapists have to do the same. And so you can't bill unless you have that number. Well, you can't get that number if you don't have a license. But yet you're in a setting where you're gaining hours experience and it's some mechanism either through a sliding scale or I bill the insurance has to occur. So to me, it's a business and a relationship with the insurance company to work that out. In terms, where I would get concerned is if there was allegations of services being billed and reimbursed for that did not occur, because to me that is clear and outright fraud.
Right.
That is outright fraud. To me, it almost sounds like this is a possible loophole or a workaround to get payment for services that you're providing, and services that the associate or the trainee student is providing in order to gain some hours.
Right.
So,
yeah, well, that's definitely, one of the area. But I think, when the intern, provided the services and then the supervisor co-signed it and then submit a bill and say, this is a psychotherapist, note, then it's a responsibility on the, supervisor, or is a responsibility on the student, because who really provide the service and what really it is, so, yeah. Betty?
My only comment on this, or perhaps the relevance, because I as long as it's an insurance company issue, I don't want to go near it with 10-foot pole. However, where I see it perhaps impacting our registrants is if there were fraudulent billing charges, then they could have their license potentially disciplined. I don't know, I'm looking at Kim, is the...
not for an intern or an associate, because if the billing is under the supervisor's number.
Okay,
Yeah.
so that there's, as long as that's the only point that I could see us interfacing with this discussion, is
Right.
if there were some kind of an impact potentially for the licensees or the registrants.
Right.
And if there isn't, and if it's all on the supervisor, then I say the only point of contact we'd have with it is when it comes to us as a disciplinary action.
Exactly, and then that's, the cases that I have seen where there's been fraudulent billing, it's not involving any intern or associate at all. It's been the licensee, the full licensee. No, there wouldn't be any. Mm-mm. Yeah, because as Jeff just, stated, he provided the services, the billing was totally on the agency.
Right.
So how would he know? And I wouldn't hold an intern or a student accountable for that because they can't directly bill. And if they are, then we have another issue. But, yeah,
So what you're saying is that it's really on the agency, to have that discretion, whether a services should be submitted to the billing. So the practice is not an issue.
The practice
The
isn't-
practice is not an issue,
No.
but, when the agency, under whether it's exempt or not, that they decide that, this services, not without the title, because they are student interns, they're not associate, they're not even there yet. And if they decided that, this is qualified, this service qualified as a psychotherapy or assessment or, counseling, and then they submit the bill, and that the responsibility or the fraudulent will be on the agency.
Yeah. And that's if it is. I mean, I think, it almost sounds to me like I think it's just a workaround to get third-party
Yes.
payment.
Yes, yes.
So, because there isn't another code available. So if we
Exactly.
need another code, then if another code's needed, then you need to go back to the insurance company and advocate for that. Because we don't set the codes.
So, I wonder, I mean, it just bothers me, that, it just doesn't sound ethical. Because, the workaround to get payment, out of the students, student services and training, I mean, I remember, maybe that's not the thing that I can imagine is like, if I walk into a haircut place, knowing that they're the students, they wouldn't charge me, the full price as if I walk into a regular, hairdresser place.
Right, but I think there's probably many a licensee out here would argue that they don't get fully and completely reimbursed for their services from the insurance companies, period. The reimbursement rate is below what they would charge if they could just outright charge.
Right.
So,
right.
I mean, you can make an argument that it's a reduced rate because that's all, the insurance company's only reimbursing at the standard rate that they've determined.
Mhm.
But if you're in private practice, you can obviously charge a little bit more.
Yeah,
So-
right.
Again, I think it's with the insurance company, and I would be happy to leave it with them.
All right. And the agency's decision. Yeah.
Yeah, I
pretty
don't
much,
regulate
right.
that either.
Right, that's the problem, isn't it? Right.
I don't want to either.
Yep. Okay. Any other discussion from the public and from the board member? Okay. So this item is closed, and thank you very much for the discussion. And so our next one is the suggestion for future agenda items. So it looks like Jan Lee, where are you? Yeah, you want to reiterate, what you have just said? I mean, at the very beginning of the meeting.
Janley Wong, NASW. You might want to arrange a presentation in the future from personnel from school districts, practitioners, administrators, teachers, counselors, school social workers, school psychologists, so you can get sort of a picture of how schools handle mental health issues and which personnel take care of them. And it's important that if a school district contracts out for those mental health services, that you also include that in the presentation. And then I think you might want to go from there after you hear their presentation.
Thank you very much. Yes. Any other suggestions for future agenda items? No? Okay, public comments for items not on the agenda. Yes, Kim.
I would like the committee members to break out their calendars because we need to set an upcoming meeting date.
Yes.
I'm going to respectfully ask that we avoid May.
Okay.
I think I'm actually going to be around there's way too much going on for me in May. I can't be there. So, April gets interesting as well because we've got a lot of association conferences. Christy, what do you think? And Roseanne, so if we did something, if we're looking for language to kind of land on, firm it up, to run next year. If we had another committee meeting in June, and if we landed on something reasonably solid, that would give us enough time to iron everything out.
Get a meeting in June, then we would have a couple of shots at it. We could either, if we looked at the language in June, there's a P&A and then a board meeting in August, and then I believe a P&A and a board meeting in October, November. So we would have 2 chances to run it through
Okay,
P&A and board.
okay.
If we needed to call another meeting to look at the language, we would have to call the other meeting of this committee if we weren't quite ready yet. To go to P&A, we would have to call it in August.
Right, okay.
So
And that would be okay. With that in mind, what is Friday, June 1st? And I'm presuming Fridays are still preferred meeting dates?
Uh-huh.
So what does June 1st and June 8th look like? Or we could even go down to the 15th. No, there's no meetings, BBS meetings at all in June. So, and I think we would be here.
Looks like, well, either one day, 1st or 8th will be fine for me. I
Okay.
cannot do 15.
Okay. Fine.
Fine, so,
Fine.
okay, should we just,
I'm going to go out on a limb here and say, let's do the 8th.
the 8th? Okay. 6/8, 8:30?
We'll either do in the morning or the afternoon, because I think we could also piggyback the License Portability Committee
Oh, okay.
on it as well. And I'm going to leave it, I'll probably defer to what the board chair would prefer to do in the morning or the afternoon. My guess is morning. I feel your pain, and I'm only driving from Elk Grove. So. Okay, so we'll do Exempt Committee in the morning.
Yes. It will work better for the portability.
And portability could be, and we can set
And
that
1
up
o'clock.
at 1 o'clock, because then that Leah can play in and then just go back.
Yes.
Okay.
Perfect.
And I don't think we're going to need many more of those anyway. So, okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. So, given that, I think our meeting is closed, adjourned, and the time is 12 o'clock. Thank you.